Technology and Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce will now come to order. Today, we will be holding a joint hearing entitled Disinformation Nation: Social Media's Role in Promoting Extremism and Misinformation. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conferencing. As part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphones each time you wish to speak. Additionally, members will need to be visible on screen in order to be recognized. Due to the anticipated length of this hearing, the committee will take a 15-minute recess around 3 o'clock to provide witnesses and members a restroom break. Finally, documents for the record can be sent to Ed Kazmarski and Joe Orlando at the email addresses we have provided to your staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. The chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes. Our nation is drowning in disinformation driven by social media. Platforms that were once used to share photos of kids with grandparents are all too often havens of hate, harassment, and division. The way I see it, there are 2 faces to each of your platforms. Facebook has Family and Friends Neighborhood, but it is right next to the one where there is a white nationalist rally every day. YouTube is a place where people share quirky videos, but down the street, anti-vaxxers, COVID deniers, QAnon supporters, and flat earthers are sharing videos. Twitter allows you to bring friends and celebrities into your home, but also Holocaust deniers, terrorists, and worse. Now, it would be one thing if every user chose where to go organically, but almost everything is scripted on social media platforms. Facebook recognizes antisocial tendencies in one user and invites them to visit the white nationalist. YouTube sees another user is interested in COVID-19 and auto starts an anti-vax video. On Twitter, a user following the trending conversation, never knowing it is driven by bots and coordinated disinformation networks run by foreign agents. Your platforms have changed how people across the planet communicate, connect, learn, and stay informed. The power of this technology is awesome and terrifying, and each of you has failed to protect your users and the world from the worst consequence of your creations. This is the first time the 3 of you have appeared before Congress since the deadly attack on the Capitol on January 6th. That event was not just an attack on our democracy and our electoral process, but an attack on every member of this committee and in the Congress. Many of us were on the House floor and in the Capitol when that attack occurred, and we were forced to stop our work of certifying the election and retreat to safety, some of us wearing gas masks and fearing for our lives. We fled as a mob desecrated the Capitol, the House floor, and our democratic process. People died that day, and hundreds were seriously injured. That attack and the movement that motivated started and was nourished on your platforms. Your platform suggested groups for people to join, videos they should view, and posts they should like, driving this movement forward with terrifying speed and efficiency. FBI documents show that many of these individuals used your platforms to plan, recruit, and execute this attack. According to independent research, users on Facebook were exposed 1.1 billion times to misinformation related to the election last year alone, despite changes to your policies and claims that you removed election misinformation. Our nation is in the middle of a terrible pandemic. Nearly 550,000 Americans have lost their lives to this deadly disease, more than any other country on the planet. And an independent study found that on Facebook alone, that users across 5 countries, including the United States, were exposed to COVID disinformation an estimated 3.8 billion times, again, despite claims of fixes and reforms. And now, as the Biden administration is working to implement the American Rescue Plan and get vaccines in people's arms, we are faced with waves of disinformation on social media about the safety and efficacy of these shots. These vaccines are our best chance we have to fight this virus. And the content that your websites are still promoting, still recommending, and still sharing is one of the biggest reasons people are refusing the vaccine. And things haven't changed. My staff found content on YouTube telling people not to get vaccines and was recommended to similar videos. The same was true on Instagram, where it was not only easy to find vaccine disinformation, but platforms recommended similar posts. The same thing happened on Facebook, except they also had anti-vax groups to suggest as well. And Twitter was no different. If you go to any of these super spreader accounts that remain up despite the policies meant to curb this anti-vax content, you'll see this content. Now, understand this. You can take this content down. You can reduce the vision. You can fix this, but you choose not to. We saw your platforms remove ISIS terrorist content. We saw you tamp down on COVID misinformation at the beginning of the pandemic. And we have seen disinformation drop when you have promoted reliable news sources and removed serial disinformation super spreaders from your platform. You have the means, but time after time, you are picking engagement and profit over the health and safety of your users, our nation, and our democracy. These are serious issues, and to be honest, it seems like you all just shrug off billion-dollar fines. Your companies need to be held accountable. We need rules, regulations, technical experts in government, and audit authority of your technologies. Ours is the committee of jurisdiction, and we will legislate to stop this. The stakes are simply too high. The chair will now recognize Mr. Latta, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, I thank the chairman for recognizing me, and I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today for a conversation that's long overdue in the Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm deeply concerned by your decisions to operate your companies in a vague and biased manner, with little to no accountability, while using Section 230 as a shield for your actions and their real-world consequences. Your companies have the power to silence the President of the United States, shut off legitimate journalism in Australia, shut down legitimate scientific debate on a variety of issues, dictate which articles or websites are seen by Americans when they search the internet. When these actions are taken, users have little to no recourse to appeal the decision if they are aware of your actions. In most cases, we simply don't know. What does this mean for everyday Americans? We are all aware of big tech's ever-increasing censorship of conservative voices and their commitment to serve the radical progressive agenda by influencing a generation of children and removing, shutting down, or canceling any news, books, and even now toys that aren't considered woke. This is fundamentally un-American. At a recent hearing on disinformation and extremism online, Professor Turley, one of the nation's foremost experts on constitutional law, testified about the little brother problem, a problem which private entities do for the government, which it cannot legally do for itself. As of January of this year, Google has a greater than 92 market share in search. Facebook has over 2.7 billion monthly users, and Twitter has 187 million daily users. Your companies have enormous control over whose ideas are seen, read, or heard around the world. This gives you great power, and if misused, as we have seen in recent years, your actions have a ripple effect throughout the world that result in American voices being removed from the marketplace of ideas. While the little brother problem of censorship is frightening enough, other serious harms are occurring on these platforms that affect ordinary Americans. Young American children and teenagers are addicted to their devices and social media. This problem has been exacerbated by the pandemic and will only get worse if children continue to be separated from their peers and cannot learn from their teachers in a classroom. Your platforms are purposely designed to keep our children hooked to their screens. The use of social media has been linked to increased rates of depression, mental illness, cyberbullying, and suicide among America's youth. Illegal drugs continue to be sold online despite your previous commitments to solve these issues. Mr. Chairman, I do ask unanimous consent to submit a letter to the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy for the record.
Without objection, so.
Thank you very much. Serious problems continue to persist, and I wonder how much you are truly dedicating to combating these actions. What actions are you taking to educate Americans about the dangers of using your site, especially the dangers for our kids? As ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, we have oversight of any change made to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Section 230 provides you with liability protection for content moderation decisions made in good faith. Based on recent actions, however, it is clear that your definition of good faith moderation includes censoring viewpoints you disagree with and establishing full independent appeals process that doesn't make its content moderation decision based on American principles of free expression. I find that highly concerning. I look forward to today's hearing as an important step in reconsidering the extent to which big tech deserves to retain the significant liability protection. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. The chair now recognizes Chair Schakowsky, chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to co-chair this meeting with you. I want to welcome our witnesses and thank them for coming. It is not an exaggeration to say that your companies have fundamentally and permanently transformed our very culture and our understanding of the world. Much of this is for good, but it is also true that our country, our democracy, even our understanding of what is truth has been harmed by the proliferation and dissemination of misinformation and extremism, all of which has deeply divided us. What our witnesses today need to take away from this hearing is that self-regulation has come to the end of its road, and that this democracy, this democratic, the people that you see before you, elected by the people, is preparing to move forth with legislation and regulation. The regulation that we seek should not attempt to limit constitutionally protected freedom of speech, but it must hold platforms accountable when they are used to incite violence and hatred, or, as in the case of the COVID pandemic, spread misinformation that costs thousands of lives. All three of the companies that are here today run platforms that are hotbeds of misinformation and disinformation. And despite all the promises and new policies to match, disinformation was rampant in the 2020 election, especially targeting vulnerable communities. For example, Spanish language ads run by the Trump campaign falsely accused President Biden of being endorsed by Venezuelan President Maduro. The spread of disinformation fed upon itself until it arrived at the Capitol of the United States on January 6th, which cost 5 lives. The lives lost in the insurgency were not the first cases of these platforms' failure, nor even the worst. In 2018, Facebook admitted a genocide of the Rohingya people in Myanmar was planned and executed on Facebook. 2020 saw the rise of coronavirus disinformation on Facebook platforms, including the playing of the, they called it the Plandemic. This film got 1.8 million views and 150,000 shares before it was removed. Disinformation like pandemic made people skeptical of the need for vaccines, and almost certainly cost contributed to the horrible loss of life during the pandemic. Disinformation and also HOPS platforms to spread viruses. I'm looking for a time. Disinformation also hops from platform to platform. Pandemic actually was first on YouTube before it was on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. Misinformation regarding the election dropped 73% across social media platforms after Twitter permanently suspended Trump, as well as also, I'm sorry? 30 seconds. Okay. And also the Capitol insurgency and QAnon. But the question really is, what took so long? The witnesses here today have demonstrated time and time again that that self-regulation has not worked. They must be held accountable for allowing disinformation and misinformation to spread. And that is why I'll be introducing the Online Consumer Protection Act, which I hope will earn bipartisan support. And thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Bilirakis, ranking member for the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, for 5 minutes for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you for participating in today's hearing, all the witnesses and the members. I've been thinking about this hearing since our side first requested this hearing last year. My time in Congress has provided me enough knowledge about the history of the committee to know what the Telecommunications Act was, and importantly, what it wasn't. Components of that law have been struck down by the courts, while other provisions are interpreted and applied differently than first conceived. This is all a departure from congressional intent. Regardless of what one thinks or whether all of the Communications Decency Act was the right approach, the same members that voted for Section 230 voted for that entire bill. The statute was meant to protect our society, specifically our children. To our witnesses today, here lies the problem for you. You don't want the federal government telling you what parts of your company you're allowed to operate. So imagine things from our perspective when you pick and choose what parts of the law you want to follow. I really do admire your ingenuity. You have created something truly remarkable, in my opinion. But with that power, you must also be good Samaritans, and you have an obligation to be stewards of your platform. If your legal department doesn't believe you're bound to the intent of the law, I would hope your moral compasses will. Many of my colleagues will raise legitimate concerns about the attack on the Capitol from January, and other colleagues can point to what occurred in our cities last summer. These were all incidents where social media escalated tension, incited chaos, and bred extremism through echo chambers and algorithms. As the new Republican leader, quite an honor, on the Commerce Protection and Commerce Committee, so the Consumer Protection and Commerce Committee, I have been digging into how your companies operate. That led me to run a survey of my district following our big tech hearing announcement. The conclusion is my constituents simply don't trust you anymore. With thousands of responses, over 82% say they do not trust big tech to be good stewards of their platforms or consistently enforce their policies. That includes my constituent who told me we were providing information to local families on teen suicide risks, on Facebook live stream. It was blocked by Facebook. Another constituent said she has seen countless teens be bullied online or simply not able to process a devastating comparison game that they are forced to deal with on social media. Others told me they stopped using your services altogether out of fear and distrust. One even told me they quit social media due to treatment from your companies over their family's Christian views. Each one of these represents a story of how your companies have failed people. And you'll be hearing from my colleagues with more of these stories about how big tech has lost its way, highlighting a much larger problem. People want to use your services, but they suspect your coders are designing what they think we should see and hear by keeping us online longer than ever, and all with the purpose to polarize or monetize us, disregarding any consequences for that assault, for the assault on our inherent freedoms, which we hold so dearly. So I don't want to hear about how changing your current law is going to hurt startups, because I've heard directly from them accusing you of anti-competitive tactics. None of us want to damage entrepreneurs. What I do want to hear is what you will do to bring our country back from the fringes and stop the poisonous practices that drive depression, isolation, and suicide, and instead cooperate with law enforcement to protect our citizens. Our kids are being lost while you say you will try to do better, as we've heard countless times already. We need true transparency and real change. We need, again, not empty promises from you. And we've heard that over and over again. The fear you should have coming into this hearing today isn't that you're going to get upbraided by a member of Congress. It's that our committee knows how to get things done when we come together. We can do this with you or without you, and we will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle and Schakowsky, for this very important hearing. We're here today because the spread of disinformation and extremism has been growing online, particularly on social media, where there are little to no guardrails in place to stop it. And unfortunately, this disinformation and extremism doesn't just stay online. It has real world, often dangerous and even violent consequences. And the time has come to hold online platforms accountable for their part in the rise of disinformation and extremism. According to a survey conducted by Pew earlier this month, 30% of Americans are still hesitant or simply do not want to take the COVID-19 vaccine. On January 6th, our nation's capital was violently attacked. This month, Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas identified domestic violent extremism as the greatest threat to the United States, and crimes against Asian Americans have risen by nearly 150% since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Each of these controversies and crimes have been accelerated and amplified on social media platforms through misinformation campaigns, the spread of hate speech, and the proliferation of conspiracy theories. 5 years ago, during the 2016 presidential elections, Facebook, Google, and Twitter were warned about, but simply ignored, their platform's role in spreading disinformation. And since then, the warnings have continued, but the problem has only gotten worse. Only after public outrage and pressure did these companies make inadequate attempts to appease critics and lawmakers. But despite the public rebuke, Wall Street continued to reward the company's strategies to promote misinformation and disinformation by driving their stock prices even higher. And now, despite repeated promises to seriously tackle this crisis, Facebook, Google, and Twitter instead routinely make minor changes to their policies in response to the public relations crisis of the day, and they will change some underlying internal policy that may or may not be related to the problem, but that's it. The underlying problem remains. So, Mr. Chairman, it is now painfully clear that neither the market nor public pressure will force these social media companies to take the aggressive action they need to take to eliminate disinformation and extremism from their platforms. And therefore, it's time for Congress and this committee to legislate and realign these companies' incentives. Today, our laws give these companies and their leaders a blank check to do nothing. Rather than limit the spread of disinformation, Facebook, Google, and Twitter have created business models that exploit the human's brain preference for divisive content to get Americans hooked on their platforms at the expense of the public interest. And it isn't just that social media companies are allowing disinformation to spread, it's that in many cases they're actively amplifying and spreading it themselves. And fines, to the extent they're levied at all, have simply become the cost of doing business. The dirty truth is that they are relying on algorithms to purposely promote conspiratorial, divisive, or extremist content so that they can take more money and add dollars. And this is because the more outrageous and extremist the content, the more engagement and views these companies get from their users, and more views equals more money, Mr. Chairman. That's what it's all about, more money. It's crucial to understand that these companies aren't just mere bystanders. They're playing an active role in the meteoric rise of disinformation and extremism because they make money on it. So when a company is actually promoting this harmful content, I question whether existing liability protection should apply. Members on this committee have suggested legislative solutions and introduced bills. The committee is going to consider all these options so that we can finally align the interests of these companies with the interests of the public and hold the platforms and their CEOs accountable when they stray. That's why you're here today, Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Pichai, and Mr. Dorsey. You've failed to meaningfully change after your platforms played a role in fomenting insurrection, in abetting the spread of the virus, and trampling American civil liberties. And while it may be true that some bad actors will shout fire in a crowded theater by promoting harmful content, your platforms are handing them a megaphone to be heard in every theater across the country and the world. Your business model itself has become the problem, and the time for self-regulation is over. It's time we legislate to hold you accountable. That's what we're going to do. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Doyle, and Ms. Schakowsky, because I know that you're very serious about moving forward on legislation, which we will do. I promise everyone. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Rogers, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 10 years ago, when I joined big tech platforms, I thought they would be a force for good. I thought that they would help us build relationships and promote transparency in Congress. I can testify today, I was wrong. That is not what has transpired. You have broken my trust. Yes, because you failed to promote the battle of ideas and free speech. Yes, because you censor political viewpoints you disagree with. Those polarizing actions matter for democracy. But do you know what convinced me big tech is a destructive force? It's how you've abused your power to manipulate and harm our children. Your platforms are my biggest fear as a parent. I'm a mom of 3 school-aged kids, and my husband and I are fighting the big tech battles in our household every day. It's a battle for their development, a battle for their mental health, and ultimately, a battle for their safety. I've monitored your algorithms. I've monitored where your algorithms lead them. It's frightening. And I know that I'm not alone. After multiple teenage suicides in my community, I reached out to our schools and we started asking questions. What's going on with our kids? What's making them feel so alone, so empty, and in despair? And this is what I heard over and over again from parents, pediatricians, school administrators, and teachers. They're all raising the alarm about social media. A day doesn't go by that I don't talk to friends and other parents who tell me their 14-year-old is depressed. She used to love soccer. Now they can't get her to do anything. She never gets off her device or leaves her room. I think about a mom who told me she can't leave her daughter alone ever because she harms herself. For the family who's recovering after almost losing their daughter to a predator she met online. These stories are not unique to me or Eastern Washington. I recently heard of a young college student who has lost 9 friends to suicide. This is unimaginable. The science on social media is becoming clearer. Between 2011 and 2018, rates of depression, self-harm, suicides, and suicide attempts exploded among American teens. During that time, rates of teen depression increased more than 60%, with a larger increase among young girls. Between 2009 and 15, emergency room admissions for self-harm among 10 to 14-year-olds tripled, and suicide substantially increased. One study found during that time, teens who use their devices for 5 or more hours a day were 66% more likely to have at least one suicide-related outcome compared to those who use their device for just one. Other studies have found that teens who spend more time online report lower psychological well-being and more feelings of loneliness. Remember, our kids, the users, are the product. You, big tech, are not advocates for children. You exploit and profit off of them. Big tech needs to be exposed and completely transparent for what you are doing to our children, so parents like me can make informed decisions. We also expect big tech to do more to protect children because you haven't done enough. Big tech has failed to be good stewards of your platforms. I have 2 daughters and a son with a disability. Let me be clear. I do not want you defining what is true for them. I do not want their future manipulated by your algorithms. I do not want their self-worth defined by the engagement tools you built to attract their attention. I do not want them to be in danger from what you've created. I do not want their emotions and vulnerabilities taken advantage of so you can make more money and have more power. I'm sure most of my colleagues on this committee who are parents and grandparents feel the same way. Over 20 years ago, before we knew what big tech would become, Congress gave you liability protections. I want to know, why do you think you still deserve those protections today? What will it take for your business model to stop harming children? I know I speak for millions of moms when I say we need answers, and we will not rest until we get them. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. The chair would now like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made a part of the record. I would now like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing and thank them all for appearing today. First, we have Mark Zuckerberg, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Facebook, Sundar Pichai, Chief Executive Officer of Google, and Jack Dorsey, Chief Executive Officer of Twitter. We want to thank all 3 of you for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. Each of you will have 5 minutes to give your opening statements. Mr. Zuckerberg, we'll start with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairs Pallone, Schakowsky, and Doyle, ranking members Rogers, Latta, and Bilirakis, and members of the committee. I'm glad that this committee is looking at all the ways that misinformation and disinformation show up in our country's discourse. There are important challenges here for our society, and we have to decide how we want to handle speech that is legal but harmful, and who should be responsible for what people say. Misinformation is not a new problem. It was 200 years ago that a congressman said that a lie would travel from Maine to Georgia while truth was still getting on his boots. And disinformation has often been spread through traditional media too. But the internet gives everyone the power to communicate, and that certainly presents unique challenges. Now, people often say things that aren't verifiably true, but that speak to their lived experiences. And I think we have to be careful restricting that. For example, if someone feels intimidated or discriminated against while voting, I believe that they should be able to share their experience, even if the election overall was fair. Now, I don't think anyone wants a world where you can only say things that private companies judge to be true, where every text message, email, video, and post has to be fact-checked before you hit send. But at the same time, we also don't want misinformation to spread that undermines confidence in vaccines, stops people from voting, or causes other harms. At Facebook, we do a lot to fight misinformation. We remove content that could lead to imminent real-world harm. We've built an unprecedented third-party fact-checking program, and if something is rated false, then we add warning labels and significantly reduce its distribution. We invest a lot in directing billions of people to authoritative information. The system isn't perfect, but it's the best approach that we've found to address misinformation in line with our country's values. It's not possible to catch every piece of harmful content without infringing on people's freedoms in a way that I don't think that we'd be comfortable with as a society. Our approach was tested in 2020 when we took extraordinary steps during an extraordinary election. We removed voting misinformation, banned hundreds of militias and conspiracy networks, including QAnon, labeled posts that prematurely or wrongly declared victory, and directed people to official results. We labeled over 180 million posts. We directed 140 million people to our official voting information center, and we helped 4.5 million people register to vote. We did our part to secure the integrity of the election. And then, on January 6th, President Trump gave a speech rejecting the results and calling on people to fight. The attack on the Capitol was an outrage, and I want to express my sympathy to all of the members, staff, and Capitol workers who had to live through this disgraceful moment in our history. And I want to express my gratitude to the Capitol Police who were on the front lines in defense of our democracy. Now, I believe that the former president should be responsible for his words, and that the people who broke the law should be responsible for their actions. So that leaves the question of the broader information ecosystem. And I can't speak for everyone else, the TV channels, radio stations, news outlets, websites, and other apps, but I can tell you what we did. Before January 6th, we worked with law enforcement to identify and address threats. During and after the attack, we provided extensive support in identifying the insurrectionists and removed posts supporting violence. We didn't catch everything, but we made our services inhospitable to those who might do harm. And when we feared that he would incite further violence, we suspended the former president's account. Now, many people are concerned that platforms can ban elected leaders. I am too. I don't think that private companies should make so many decisions like this alone. We need an accountable process, which is why we created an independent oversight board that can overrule our decisions. And we need democratically agreed rules for the internet. The reality is our country is deeply divided right now, and that isn't something that tech companies alone can fix. And we all have a part to play in helping to turn things around, and I think that starts with taking a hard look at how we got here. Now, some people say that the problem is that social networks are polarizing us, but that's not at all clear from the evidence or research. Polarization was rising in America long before social networks were even invented, and it's falling or stable in many other countries where social networks are popular. Others claim that algorithms feed us content that makes us angry because it's good for business, but that's not accurate either. I believe that the division we see today is primarily the result of a political and media environment that drives Americans apart, and we need to reckon with that if we're going to make progress. Now, I know that technology can help bring people together. We see it every day on our platforms. Facebook is successful because people have a deep desire to connect and share, not to stand apart and fight. And we believe that connectivity and togetherness are more powerful ideals than division and discord, and that technology can be part of the solution to the challenges our society is facing. And we are ready to work with you to move beyond hearings and get started on real reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. Now, Mr. Pichai, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Pichai, are you unmuted?
My volume on. Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, Chairwoman Schakowsky, Ranking Member Bilirakis, Full Committee Chair Pallone, and Full Committee Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. To begin, I want to express my sympathies to those who have lost loved ones to COVID or the recent gun violence in Boulder and Atlanta. In difficult times, we are reminded of what connects us as Americans, the hope that we can make things better for our families and our communities. And we at Google are committed to that work. I joined Google because I believed the internet was the best way to bring the benefits of technology to more people. Over the past 3 decades, we have seen how it's inspired the best in society by expanding knowledge, powering businesses, and providing opportunities for discovery and connection. I'm proud that anyone can turn to Google for help, whether they are looking for vaccine information, learning new skills on YouTube, or using digital tools to grow their businesses. In 2020, our products helped 2 million US businesses and publishers generate $426 billion in economic activity. We are energized by the opportunity to help people at scale and humbled by the responsibility that comes with it. Thousands of people at Google are focused on everything from cyber attacks to privacy to today's topic, misinformation. Our mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Core to that is providing trustworthy content and opportunities for free expression while combating misinformation. It's a big challenge without easy answers. 500 plus hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute, and approximately 15% of Google searches each day are new to us. 18 months ago, no one had heard of COVID-19. Sadly, coronavirus was the top trending search last year. Staying ahead of new challenges to keep users safe is a top priority. We saw the importance of that on January 6th, when a mob stormed the US Capitol. Google strongly condemns these violent attacks on our democracy and mourns the lives lost. In response, we raised up authoritative sources across our products. On YouTube, we removed live streams and videos that violated our incitement to violence policies and began issuing strikes to those in violation of our presidential elections policy. We removed apps from the Play Store for inciting violence and stopped ads referencing the 2020 election or the Capitol riots as part of our sensitive events policy. We were able to act quickly because we were prepared ahead of the 2020 elections. Our reminders of how to register and vote were viewed over 2 billion times. YouTube's election results information panels have been viewed more than 8 billion times. We also work to keep campaigns safe from cyber attacks and protect platforms from abuse. After the December 8th safe harbor deadline for states to certify elections, we removed content from YouTube that alleged widespread fraud changed the outcome of the election. This past year, we've also focused on providing quality information during the pandemic. Globally, we've committed over $550 million in ad grants for COVID-related PSAs to governments, health organizations, and nonprofits. On YouTube, our COVID information panels have been viewed over 400 billion times. We also removed 850,000 videos and blocked nearly 100 million COVID-related ads throughout 2020. Across all of this work, we strive to have transparent policies and enforce them without regard to politics or point of view. Our ability to provide a range of information and viewpoints, while also being able to remove misinformation, is possible only because of legal frameworks like Section 230. It's foundational to the open web, which has been a powerful force for good for so many. I look forward to sharing more about our approach today and working together to create a path forward for the web's next 3 decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pichai. The chair now recognizes Mr. Dorsey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, members of the Energy and Commerce Committee and its subcommittees, for the opportunity to speak with the American people about how Twitter may be used to spread disinformation and our solutions. My remarks will be brief so we can move to your questions and discussion. In our discussion today, some of you might bring up specific tweets or examples, and I'll probably have an answer like, my team will follow up with you. I don't think that's useful. I'd rather us focus on principles and approaches to address these problems. I'll start with ours. We believe in free expression. We believe in free debate and conversation to find the truth. At the same time, we must balance that with our desire for our service not to be used to sow confusion, division, or destruction. This makes the freedom to moderate content critical to us. Our process to moderate content is designed to constantly evolve. We observe what's happening on our service. We work to understand the ramifications, and we use that understanding to strengthen our operations. We push ourselves to improve based on the best information we have. Much of what we're likely to discuss today are entirely new situations the world has never experienced before, and in some unique cases involve elected officials. And we believe the best way to face a big new challenge is through narrowing the problem to have the greatest impact. Disinformation is a broad concept. We needed to focus our approach on where we saw the greatest risk if we hope to have any impact at all. So we chose to focus on disinformation leading to offline harm, and 3 categories to start: manipulated media, public health, and civic integrity. Many of you will have strong opinions on how effective we are in this work. Some of you will say we're doing too much and removing free speech rights. Some of you will say we're not doing enough and end up causing more harm. Both points of view are reasonable and worth exploring. If we woke up tomorrow and decided to stop moderating content, we'd end up with a service very few people or advertisers would want to use. Ultimately, we're running a business, and a business wants to grow the number of customers it serves. Enforcing policy is a business decision. Different businesses and services will have different policies, some more liberal than others. And we believe it's critical this variety continues to exist. Forcing every business to behave the same reduces innovation and individual choice, and diminishes free marketplace ideals. If instead we woke up tomorrow and decided to ask the government to tell us what content to take down or leave up, we may end up with a service that couldn't be used to question the government. This is a reality in many countries today and is against the right of an individual. This would also have the effect of putting enormous resource requirements on businesses and services, which would further entrench only those who are able to afford it. Smaller businesses would not be able to compete, and all activity would be centralized into very few businesses. So how do we resolve these 2 viewpoints? One way is to create shared protocols. Social media has proven itself important enough to be worthy of an internet protocol, one that a company like Twitter can contribute to and compete on creating experiences people love to use. We've started work on such a protocol, which we call Blue Sky. It intends to act as a decentralized, open source social media protocol, not owned by any single company or organization. Any developer around the world can help develop it, just as any company can access its services. How does an open protocol address the concerns raised here? Greater transparency is the strongest benefit. Anyone around the world can see everything that's happening in the network, including exactly how it works. One doesn't have to trust a company, just look at the source code. Second, since the base protocol is shared, it will increase innovation around business models, recommendation algorithms, and moderation controls, which are in the hands of individuals rather than private companies. This will allow people to experiment in a market-based approach. Finally, it will allow all of us to observe, acknowledge, and address any societal issues that arise much faster. Having more eyes on the problems will lead to more impactful solutions that can be built directly into this protocol, making the network far more secure and resilient. A decentralized open source protocol for social media is our vision and work for the long term. We continue the cycle mentioned earlier of constantly improving our approach to content moderation in the short term. I hope our discussion today will focus on more enduring solutions. One final note, we are a bunch of humans with a desire to make the world around us better for everyone living today and those that come after us. We make mistakes in prioritization and in execution. We commit to being open about these and doing our best to remedy what we control. We appreciate the enormous privilege we have in building technologies to host some of the world's most important conversations. And we honor the desire to create better outcomes for everyone who interacts with them. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Well, we've concluded witness opening statements. At this time, we will move to member questions. I want to make sure that members are aware that our witnesses are being assisted by counsel, and during questions, our witnesses may briefly mute themselves to seek advice of counsel, which is permitted. Each member will have 5 minutes to start asking questions of our witnesses. I ask everyone to please adhere to that 5-minute rule, as we have many people that want to ask questions. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Gentlemen, who's speaking?
Jeff Duncan, point of order.
Yes, sir.
If the witnesses are advised by counsel and we're not swearing them in, why would they need counsel?
In previous hearings, we've always permitted witnesses to have counsel. Sometimes you'll see them at a hearing just leaning back and talking to their counsel before question. But it's allowed under our rules. And I just wanted to make members aware that they may mute themselves while that's going on.
They should be sworn in, but I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Gentlemen, my time is short, and I ask that you make your responses as brief and to the point as possible. If I ask you a yes or no question, I'm just looking for a yes or no, so please respond appropriately. I want to start by asking all three of you if your platform bears some responsibility for disseminating disinformation related to the election and the Stop the Steal movement that led to the attack on the Capitol. Just a yes or no answer. Mr. Zuckerberg.
Chairman, I think our responsibility is to build systems that can help.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I just want a yes or no answer. Okay, yes or no? Do you bear some responsibility for what happened?
Congressman, our responsibility is to make sure that we build effective systems to help fight the spread of this.
Is not to answer the question. Mr. Pichai, yes or no?
We always feel a deep sense of responsibility, but I think we worked hard. This election effort was one of our most substantive efforts.
Is that a yes or a no?
Congressman, it's a complex question.
Okay, we'll move on. Mr. Dorsey.
Yes, but you also have to take into consideration a broader ecosystem. It's not just about the technology platforms we use.
Thank you. Thank you. And I agree with that. Mr. Zuckerberg, independent analysis has shown that despite all the things that Facebook did during the election, users still interacted with election misinformation roughly 1.1 billion times over the last year. The initial Stop the Steal group started on Facebook and gained over 350,000 followers in less than a day, faster than almost any other in your platform's history. And they were immediately calling for violence. In mid-December, you stopped promoting high-quality news outlets for election content at a time when the disinformation was at its height. And finally, the FBI has released numerous documents showing that many of the insurrectionists used Facebook to coordinate and plan the attack on January 6th. So my question is, how is it possible for you not to at least admit that Facebook played a central role or a leading role in facilitating the recruitment, planning, and execution of the attack on the Capitol?
Chairman, my point is that I think that the responsibility here lies with the people who took the actions to break the law and do the insurrection, and secondarily, also the people who spread that content, including the president, but others as well, with repeated rhetoric over time, saying that the election was rigged and encouraging people to organize. I think that those people bear the primary responsibility as well, and that was the point that I was making.
I understand that, but your platforms supercharged that. You took a thing and magnified in 12 hours. You got 350,000 people in your site. You gin this up. Your algorithms make it possible to supercharge these kinds of opinions. I think we're here because of what these platforms enable, how your choices, put our lives and our democracy at risk. And many of us just find it just unacceptable. I want to ask each of you another question. Do you think vaccines that have been approved for COVID-19 work? Just yes or no. Do you think the vaccines that have been approved work? Mr. Zuckerberg.
Yes.
Mr. Pichai.
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Dorsey.
Yes, but I don't think we're here to discuss our own personal opinions.
I just want to know if you think the vaccines work. Yes?
Yes, however.
Thank you. Okay, so if you think the vaccines work, why have your companies allowed accounts that repeatedly offend your vaccine disinformation policies to remain up? I mean, according to report, just 12 accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram account for 65% of all the vaccine disinformation on your platforms. You're exposing tens of millions of users to this every day. I don't have the stats on YouTube, but my understanding is it's similar. So my question is, Why in the midst of a global pandemic that has killed over 500,000 Americans that you haven't taken these accounts down that are responsible for the preponderance of vaccine disinformation on your platforms? Will you all commit to taking these platforms down today, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Congressman, yes, we do have a policy against allowing.
Oh, I know you have a
vaccine
policy, but will you
disinformation.
take the sites down today? You still have 12 people up on your site doing this. Will you take them down?
Congressman, I would need to look at and have our team look at the exact example to make sure
Look
they
at it
violate
today
the policies,
and
but we
get
have a
back to
policy in
us
place
tomorrow
for this.
because those still exist. We found them as early as last night. Mr. Pichai, how about you?
We have removed over 850,000 videos in
If you remove
2020
them
on
all, do you
COVID
still
and
have people that are spreading disinformation on your platforms? There's about 12 super spreaders.
we have clear policies and we take down content. Some of the content is allowed if it's people's personal experiences, but we definitely
Okay,
take
thank
down
you. Mr.
widespread.
Dorsey, I see my time is getting expired. Mr. Dorsey, will you take these sites down? You got
Yes.
about 12 super spreaders. Will you take them down?
Yes, we remove everything against our policy.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I will now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Latta, for his 5 minutes.
I thank my friend for yielding. Amanda Todd was just 15 years old when she hung herself. Amanda met a man online who took inappropriate screenshots of Amanda and proceeded to follow her around the internet and harass her for years. He found her classmates on Facebook, and he would send them the picture he took of her. To cope with the anxiety, Amanda turned to drugs and alcohol, but it became too much for her. Mr. Zuckerberg, clearly, Ms. Todd was underage, so the photo that was shared to harass her was illegal. Do you believe that Facebook bears any responsibility for the role it played in her death, yes or no?
Sorry, I was muted. Congressman, it's a incredibly sad story, and I think that we certainly have a responsibility to make sure that we're building systems that can fight and remove this kind of harmful content. And in the case of child exploitation content, we've been building systems for a long time that use AI, and we have thousands of people working on being able to identify this content and remove it. And I think our systems are generally pretty effective at this. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure that we keep improving them.
My time's pretty short, but would you say yes or no then?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Well, in the question, yes or no, then any responsibility?
Congressman, I believe that the responsibility
Okay.
of the platforms...
Well, let me move on because I've got very short on time. Do you believe that Facebook should be held accountable for any role in her death? Yes or no?
Congressman, the responsibility that I think platforms should have is to build effective systems to moderate this content.
I'm going to have to take that, just not responding to the question. Unfortunately, stories like Amanda Todd's are only becoming more common. While we often talk about how your platforms can be used for good or evil, the evil seems to persevere. Mr. Zuckerberg, you've publicly stated that you support thoughtful changes to Section 230 to ensure that tech companies are held accountable for certain actions that happen on their platforms, such as child exploitation. What specific changes do you support in Section 230?
Thanks, Congressman. I would support two specific changes, especially for large platforms. Although I want to call out that I think for smaller platforms, I think we need to be careful about any changes that we make that remove their immunity, because that could hurt competition. So let me just call on these for larger platforms. I think first, platforms should have to issue transparency reports that state the prevalence of content across all different categories of harmful content, everything from child exploitation to terrorism to incitement of violence to intellectual property violations to pornography, whatever the different harms are. And
let me ask you quick now, where those transparency reports be reported to, and how often do you think those should be going out?
Well, Congressman, as a model, Facebook has been doing something to this effect for every quarter, right, where we report on the prevalence of each category of harmful content and how effective our systems are at identifying that content and removing it in advance. And I think the company should be held accountable for having effective systems to do that broadly. The second change that I would propose is creating accountability for the large platforms to have effective systems in place to moderate and remove clearly illegal content. So things like sex trafficking or child exploitation or terrorist content. And I think it would be reasonable to condition immunity for the larger platforms on having a generally effective system in place to moderate clearly illegal types of content.
Let me interrupt real quick because I'm running really short on time, because I know in your testimony you're talking about that you say that platforms should not be held liable if a particular piece of content evades its detection. So again, that's one of the areas when you're talking about the transparency and also the accountability I'd like to follow up on. I have to go on real quick. Mr. Pichai, yes or no, do you agree with Mr. Zuckerberg's changes to Section 230?
There are definitely good proposals around transparency and accountability, which I've seen in various legislative proposals as well, which I think are important principles, and we would certainly welcome legislative approaches in that area.
Okay, Mr. Dorsey, do you agree with Mr. Zuckerberg, yes or no, on the changes on 230?
I think the ideas around transparency are good. I think it's going to be very hard to determine what's a large platform and a small platform, and it may incentivize the wrong things.
Okay, gentlemen's time has expired.
Thank you very much. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Chair Schakowsky, Chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Mr. Zuckerberg, immediately after the Capitol insurgency, Sheryl Sandberg did an interview in which she insisted that the siege was largely planned on smaller platforms, but court filings actually show something quite the opposite, that the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers used Facebook to coordinate in real time during the siege. And so my question for you is, will you admit today that Facebook groups in particular played a role in fomenting the extremism that we saw and that led to the Capitol siege?
Congresswoman, thanks for the question on this. In the comment that Sheryl made, what I believe that we were trying to say was, and what I stand behind, is what was widely reported at the time, that after January 6th.
I'm sorry to interrupt, as many of my colleagues have had to do, because we only have 5 minutes. But would you say that, and would you admit that Facebook played a role?
Congresswoman, I think certainly there was content on our services, and from that perspective, I think that there's further work that we need to do to make our services and moderation more effective.
I hear that. Okay, I'm going to ask Mr. Pichai a question. Many companies have used Section 230 as a shield to escape consumer protection laws. And I have a bill that would actually not protect companies that do that. And so, Mr. Pichai, would you agree that that would be a proper use to not allow liability protection for those who violate consumer protection laws?
Congresswoman, consumer protection laws are very important in many areas, like we comply with COPPA and HIPAA. I think the right approach is to have legislation in applicable areas and have us.
Okay, I'm going to have to interrupt again. Is that a yes? That if a law has been broken, a consumer protection law, that there would not be liability protection under Section 230 for you?
We rely on the liability protections to actually take strong action in particularly new types of content. When the Christchurch shooting happens, within a few minutes, our teams have to make decisions about the content to take down. That certainty is what we rely on. But I agree with you that we should have strong consumer protection laws and be subject to it, and have agencies like the FTC have clear oversight over those laws and how we comply with them.
Let me just ask a real yes or thank you, a real yes or no quickly. Do you think that when you take money to run advertisements that promote disinformation, that you are exempt from liability? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Section 230.
Mr. Zuckerberg, yes or no?
Congresswoman, I don't know the legal answer to that, but we don't allow misinformation in our ads. And any ad that's been fact checked as false, we don't allow to run as an ad.
Okay, and Mr. Dorsey?
Again, I also would need to review the legal precedent for it, but we would not allow that.
Okay, and Mr. Pichai?
We are subject to FTC's deceptive ad practices, so there are statutes which apply to us. We removed over 3 billion bad ads last year alone.
Okay, let me ask one more question. Do you think that Section 230 should be expanded to trade agreements that are being made, as happened in the U.S. Trade agreement with Mexico and Canada? Yes or no? Mr. Zuckerberg.
Congresswoman, my primary goal would be to help update Section 230 to reflect the kind of modern reality and what we've learned over 25 years. But that said, I do still think that Section 230 plays a foundational role in the development of the internet and the companies getting built. So I do think that we should support it.
I'm talking now about trade agreements, Mr. Pichai.
Congresswoman, I think there's value in it, but if there are evolution of Section 230, that should apply. And so in a flexible way, being able to do that would be good, I think.
Mr. Dorsey.
I don't fully understand the ramifications of what you're suggesting, so we have to review that.
To have a liability shield that would be international and ratified in trade agreements, and I think it's a bad idea.
Okay, gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Bilirakis, subcommittee on ranking member of the subcommittee on consumer protection and commerce, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Mr. Dorsey, you have heard briefly about what I'm hearing from, again, in my district, my opening remarks, you've heard them. The other key part with these stories that we're hearing when we conduct these surveys is how we empower law enforcement. In a hearing last year, we received testimony that since 2016, Twitter has intentionally curtailed sharing threat data with law enforcement fusion centers. Here's the question. You're well aware that on Twitter and Periscope, that traffic has increased from bad actors seeking to groom children for molestation, lure females into sex trafficking, sell illegal drugs, incite violence, and even threaten to murder police officers. Are you willing to reinstate this cooperation, retain evidence, and provide law enforcement the tools to protect our most vulnerable? Yes or no?
Well, first, child sexual exploitation has no place on our platform, and I don't believe that's true. We work with local law enforcement regularly.
So you're saying that this is not true? What I'm telling you. Are you willing to reinstate? In other words, it's not going on now. Reinstate this cooperation with law enforcement to retain evidence and provide law enforcement the tools to protect our most vulnerable.
We would love to work with you in more detail on what you're seeing, but we work with law enforcement regularly. We have a strong partnership.
So you're saying that this is not true, what I'm telling you?
I don't believe so, but we'd love to understand the specifics.
will you commit to doing what I'm telling you you're not doing in the future, and work with me on this?
We'll commit to continue doing what we are doing.
And what is that? You're saying that
Working.
So in other words,
local law enforcement.
okay. Well, let me go on to the next question, but I'm going to follow up with this to make sure you're doing this. I mean, our children's lives are in jeopardy here. Mr. Zuckerberg, we have heard you acknowledge mistakes about your products before. There are now media reports of an Instagram for under 13 being launched. My goodness. Between this and YouTube Kids, you and Mr. Pichai have obviously identified a business case for targeting this age bracket with content, and I find that very concerning, targeting this particular age bracket, 13 and under. Given these free services, how exactly will you be making money, or are you trying to monetize our children too and get them addicted early? And will you be allowing your own children to use this site with the default settings? We're talking about the site that apparently is being launched for children under 13 and under, or under 13 actually. Can you please answer that question for me?
Congressman, we're early in thinking through how this service would work. There is clearly a large number of people under the age of 13 who would want to use a service like Instagram. We currently do not allow them to do that. I think
what would be the purpose? What would be beneficial? What would be beneficial to our children to launch this kind of service?
Well, Congressman, I think helping people stay connected with friends and learn about different content online is broadly positive. There are clearly issues that need to be thought through and worked out, including how parents can control the experience of kids, especially kids under the age of 13. And we haven't worked through all of that yet, so we haven't kind of formally announced the plans, but I think that something like this could be quite helpful for a lot of people.
Excuse me. Okay, I'll reclaim my time. Mr. Pichai, your company has had failures curating content for kids. What advice would you offer your colleague here?
Congressman, we've invested a lot in a one-of-a-kind product, YouTube Kids. The content there is, we work with trusted content partners. Think Sesame Street as an example of the type of channel you would find there. Science videos and cartoons, and we take great effort to make sure.
I got to reclaim my time. I have one last question for Mr. Zuckerberg. Do you have concerns with what has appeared on your platform hosted by YouTube? With regard to your children, but in general, do you have concerns? Yes or no?
Congressman, are you asking me about YouTube?
Yes, I'm asking you about YouTube.
Congressman, I use YouTube to watch educational videos with my children.
Yeah. Do you have concerns personally for your children and your family? Personally, do you have concerns?
Congressman, my children are 5 and 3 years old. So when I watch content on YouTube with them, I'm doing it and supervising them. So in that context, no, I haven't particularly had concerns, but I think it's important that if anyone is building a service for kids under the age of 13 to use by themselves, that there are appropriate parental controls.
Gentlemen's time has expired. I'm going to ask all members too to try to stick to our 5-minute rule so that we can get out of here before midnight. Chair will now recognize Mr. Pallone, the full committee chair, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. My questions are of Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Pichai, but I just want to say, after listening to the two of your testimony, you definitely give the impression that you don't think that you're actively in any way promoting this misinformation and extremism, and I totally disagree with that. You're not passive bystanders. You're not, nonprofits or religious organizations that are trying to do a good job for humanity. You're making money. And the point we're trying to make today, or at least I am, is that when you spread this information, actual misinformation, extremism, actively promote it and amplify it, you do it because you make more money. And so I kind of deny the basic premise of what you said. But let me get to the questions. Let me ask Mr. Zuckerberg, according to a May 2020 Wall Street Journal report, a Facebook researcher concluded that Facebook's own recommendation tools were tied to a significant rise in membership in extremist Facebook groups in Germany. I wrote to you last month requesting this research and related documents. I trust you'll fully cooperate with the committee's inquiry and provide all requested documents and information. But my question is, and please yes or no, were you aware of this research showing that 64% of the members in the extremist Facebook groups studied joined because of Facebook's own recommendations tool, joined these extremist groups in Germany? Were you aware of that, yes or no?
Congressman, this is something that we study because we want to make sure our products improve.
But I'm just asking whether you were aware of it. It's a simple question, yes or no. Were you aware of it? That's all I'm asking. Were you aware of this?
Aware at what time? After we studied that?
I just asked if you were aware of it, Mr. Zuckerberg. Yes or no? If not, I'm going to assume that the answer is yes. Okay?
Congressman, I've seen the study. It was about content leading up to the German election, and we since made changes to the platform.
Which relates to that. You said yes. Okay. The troubling research I mentioned demonstrates that Facebook was not simply allowing disinformation and extremism to spread, it actively amplified it and spread it. This is my point. Nonetheless, Facebook didn't permanently stop recommending political and civil groups to the United States until after the January 6th insurrection, years after it was made aware of this research. The fact that Facebook's own recommendation system helped populate extremist groups compels us to reevaluate platform's liabilities. Now, back to that Wall Street Journal article. Facebook's chief product officer, Chris Cox, championed an internal effort to address division on Facebook and proposed a plan that would have reduced the spread of content by hyperactive users on the far left and far right. The article alleges, Mr. Zuckerberg, that you personally reviewed this proposal and approved it, but only after its effectiveness was decreased to 80%. Is that true? Yes or no, please?
Congressman, we've made a lot of measures that aim to fight this content, including.
Did you approve after its effectiveness was decreased to 80%? Yes or no?
Congressman, I can't speak to that specific example, but we've put in place a lot of different measures, and in the aggregate, I think that they're effective, including.
Did you review the proposal and approve it?
Congressman, we do a lot of work in this area, and I review a lot of proposals, and we've moved forward on a lot of steps.
It's not a difficult question. I'm just asking if you reviewed this internal proposal and you approved it. You won't even answer that. It's so easy to answer that question. It's very specific. All right, you won't answer, right? Yes or no?
Congressman, that's not what I said. I said I did review that, in addition to many other proposals and things that we've taken action on, including shutting off recommendations for civic and political groups.
Did you approve it with the 80% decrease in effectiveness?
Congressman, I don't remember that specifically, but we've taken a number of different steps on this.
Let me go to Mr. Pichai. Mr. Pichai, according to the New York Times, YouTube's recommendation algorithm is responsible for more than 70% of the time users spend on YouTube. In fact, a former design ethicist at Google was quoted as saying, "If I'm YouTube and I want you to watch more, I'm always going to steer you towards Crazy Town." Mr. Pichai, is YouTube's recommendation algorithm designed to encourage users to stay on the site? Yes or no? Is it designed to encourage users to stay on the site? Yes or no?
Content responsibilities are number one goal, so that trumps everything.
So I'm only asking, very simple, whether your YouTube's recommendation algorithm is designed to encourage users to stay on the site. Simple question, yes or no?
That's not the sole goal, Congressman.
But it is one of the goals. So the answer is yes. Okay. So the bottom line is, simply put, your company's bottom line compel you to amplify extremist and dangerous content. You're not bystanders. And what happens online doesn't stay online. It has real-world consequences. That's why Congress has to act, because you're not bystanders. You're encouraging this stuff. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Ms. Rogers, the full committee ranking member, for 5 minutes.
We've tragically lost a number of young people to suicide in my community. In a 3-year period from 2013 to 2016, the suicide rate more than doubled in Spokane County. In the last 6 months, One high school lost 3 teens. Right now, suicide is the second leading cause of death in the entire state of Washington for teens 15 to 19 years old. As I mentioned, it's led to many painful conversations, trying to find some healing for broken families and communities. And together we've been asking, what's left our kids with a deep sense of brokenness? Why do children, including kids we've lost in middle school, feel so empty at such a young, vulnerable age? Well, some studies are confirming what parents in my community already know. Too much time on screens and social media is leading to loneliness and despair. And it seems to be an accepted truth in the tech industry. Because what we're hearing today, making money is more important. Bill Gates put a cap on screen time for his daughter. Steve Jobs once said in a quote, "We limit how much technology our kids use at home." Mr. Zuckerberg, you've also said that your kids, or you don't want your kids sitting in front of screens passively consuming content. So Mr. Zuckerberg, yes or no, do you agree too much time in front of screens passively consuming content is harmful to children's mental health?
Congresswoman, the research that I've seen on this suggests that if people are using computers and social apps...
Could you answer yes or no? I'm sorry, could you use yes or no?
I don't think that the research is conclusive on that, but I can summarize what I've learned if that's helpful.
I'll follow up at a later time, because I do know that Facebook has acknowledged that passive consumption on your platform is leading to people feeling worse. And you've said that going from video to video is not positive, yet Facebook is designed to keep people scrolling. Instagram is designed to get users to go from video to video. So I would like to ask you, if you've said earlier that you don't want kids sitting in front of the screens passively consuming content and your products are designed to increase screen time, do you currently have any limitations on your own kids' use of your products, or how do you think that will change as they get older?
Sure, Congressman. My daughters are 5 and 3, and they don't use our products. Actually, that's not exactly true. My eldest daughter, Max, I let her use Messenger Kids sometimes to message her cousins. But overall, the research that we've seen is that using social apps to connect with other people can have positive mental health benefits and well-being benefits, like helping people feel more connected and less lonely. Passively consuming content doesn't have those positive benefits to well-being, but isn't necessarily negative. It just isn't as positive as connecting. And the way we design our algorithms is to encourage meaningful social interactions. So it's a common misconception that our teams are goaled or even have goals of trying to increase the amount of time that people spend. The newsfeed team at Facebook and the Instagram team.
Thank you. Mr. Zuckerberg, I do have a couple more questions. So do you agree that your business model and the design of your products is to get as many people on the platform as possible and to keep them there for as long as possible? If you could answer yes or no, that would be great.
Congresswoman, from a mission perspective, we want to serve everyone, but our goal is not I don't give our newsfeed team or our Instagram team goals around increasing the amount of time that people spend. I believe that if we build a useful product,
Okay, thank you. We all have limited time. I think the business model suggests that it is true. It was mentioned earlier that you're studying extremism. I'd like to ask yes or no of all of you. Beginning with Mr. Zuckerberg, has Facebook conducted any internal research as to the effect your products are having on the mental health of our children?
Congresswoman, I know that this is something that we try to study.
Can you say yes or no? I'm sorry.
I believe the answer is yes.
Okay. Mr. Dorsey, has Twitter?
I don't believe so, but we'll follow up with you.
Okay. Mr. Pichai, has Google conducted any research on the effect your products are having on the mental health of children?
We consult widely with expert third parties on this area, including SAMHSA and other mental health organizations, and invest a lot of time and effort in this area.
Okay, I would like to see that. It sounds like you've studied extremism. Let's get focused on our children.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rush for 5 minutes. Bobby, you need to unmute. There you go. Nope, you're still muted.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all agree that social media sites should not be tools for stoking racial division or exacerbating racial injustices. However, there's a growing body of research that demonstrates the disproportionate effects of disinformation and white supremacist extremism on women and people of color, especially Black people. We have seen and continue to see that too often social media sites put their earnings before equality. Simply stated, your corporations carelessly put profits over people. Misinformation, outlandish conspiracy theories, and incendiary content targeting minorities remains prevalent. And social media companies, your companies, are profiting from hate and racism on these platforms by harvesting data and generating advertising revenue from such content. There is only one comparison that remotely approaches the avarice and moral discrepancy of your companies, and that is the slave chocolate variant of our nation's shameful and inhumane and most difficult dark days in the past. This is the very reason why I asked Mr. Dorsey. I remember you at our 2018 hearing to commit to commissioning an independent third-party civil rights audit of Twitter. This request at the hearing was followed up with my joint letter from Chairman Pallone and myself confirming that commitment. It is 3 years later, and I'm still waiting, Mr. Dorsey, for the results of that audit. Where is that audit, Mr. Dorsey?
Thank you. We've taken another approach, which is to work with civil rights orgs on a regular basis. We have regular conversations with civil rights orgs multiple times a year.
Mr. Dorsey, where is the audit that members of Congress, including the chairman of the committee, where is the audit that we asked you and you agreed to forward?
We don't have it. We thought a different approach.
I don't have it either, and I thought that you were being very, very disingenuous. As a matter of fact, I thought that you had intentionally lied to the committee, and you should be condemned for that. And I can't wait until we come up with legislation that will deal with you and your cohorts in a very, very effective way. This was nothing but an empty promise that you made. You haven't taken this issue seriously. And Mr. Dorsey, I, as a Black man in America, my experiences are different from your experiences. This audit is very, very important to me and to those who are similarly situated just as I am. Facebook, to their credit, has completed an audit. And there's no reason, simply no reason under the sun that a corporation as large as yours should not have completed that audit. Mr. Dorsey, has Twitter evaluated the disparate impact from COVID-19 vaccination misinformation that effect on the African American community? And secondly, has the company even attempted to identify methods to combat COVID-19 misinformation targeted at African Americans and amplify reliable, trustworthy vaccine information?
Yes, on both. And we review with civil rights orgs directly on a regular basis. That is the solution we chose.
Gentlemen's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Upton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as I listen to this hearing, like it or not, it sounds like everybody on both sides of the aisle is not very happy. I think we all believe that there is a lot of responsibility that should be shared for some of the issues that we've raised today by the three of you. And I would just offer or speculate, I guess you could say, that we're going to see some changes in section 230. You know, the president, former President Trump, vetoed a pretty big bill, the defense bill, earlier last year over this very issue because he wanted the total repeal, and he didn't get it. But I know that the Senate now has got some legislation that's pending that's looking at a couple reforms, and my sense is that we may see something here in the near future as well. I serve on as one of only 2 House members on the Commission on Combating Synthetic Opioid Trafficking. It's a multi-federal agency. It's co-chaired by David Trone in the House and Tom Cotton in the Senate. And there is a lot of concern that we all have, not only as parents, but as community leaders across the country on opioids and the inability to remove illegal offers of opioids, steroids, even fake COVID-19 vaccines. Very troubling, I think, as we see some of these platforms push such content to a user in real search of it. So I guess my first question is to you, Mr. Zuckerberg. The sale of illegal drugs on your platform does violate your policy, yet it does remain a problem on your platforms. Can you explain the resources that you currently have devoted to addressing the issue and whether or not you plan to devote more? And this is an issue that I intend to raise with the commission as we look forward to this in the next number of months.
Thanks, Congressman. I think this is an important area and a good question. We have more than 1,000 engineers who work on our what we call integrity systems, that basically are AI systems that try to help find content that violates our policies. You're right that content does violate our policies. And we also have more than 35,000 people who work in content review who basically are either responding to flags that they get from the community or checking things that our AI systems flag for them but aren't sure about. And this is an area, when we're talking about reforming Section 230, where I think it would be reasonable to expect that large platforms especially build effective systems to be able to combat and fight this kind of clearly illegal content. I think that there will be a lot of ongoing debate about how to handle content which people find distasteful or maybe harmful but is legal. But in this case, when the content is illegal, I think it is pretty reasonable to expect that large platforms build effective systems for moderating this.
So we saw earlier this week, of course, we don't know all the facts on this terrible shooting in Boulder, Colorado. It appears, at least some of the initial reports, that the alleged shooter was in fact bullied. And I think I saw some press reports that some of it had happened online as well. What process do you have that it would allow parents or families to be able to pursue anti-bullying efforts that might be on your platforms?
Thanks, Congressman. I think bullying is a really important case to consider for Section 230 because, first of all, it's horrible and we need to fight it, and we have policies that are against it. But it also is often the case that that bullying content is not clearly illegal. So when we talk about needing the ability under something like Section 230 to be able to moderate content, which is not only clearly illegal content, but broader, one of the primary examples that we have in mind is making sure that we can stop people from bullying children. And here we work with a number of advocacy groups. We work with law enforcement to help fight this. This is a huge effort and part of what we do, and I think it's extremely important.
And other than taking the approach that you don't want to see any changes to 230, what suggestions might you have for us as we examine this issue?
Sorry, Congressman, I'm not saying that I don't think that there should be changes. I'm saying that I think 230 still broadly is important, so I wouldn't repeal the whole thing. But the three changes that I've basically suggested are, one is around transparency, that large platforms should have to report on a regular cadence for each category of harmful content, how much of that harmful content they're finding and how effective their systems are at dealing with it. The second thing I think that we should do is hold large platforms to a standard where they should have effective systems for handling clearly illegal content like opioids or child exploitation or things like that. And the third thing that I think is an important principle is that these policies really do need to apply more to large platforms. And I think we need to find a way to exempt small platforms so that way, when I was getting started with Facebook, if we'd gotten hit with a lot of lawsuits around content, it might have been prohibitive for me to get started. And I think none of us here want to see the next set of platforms from being stopped from kind of being able to get started and grow.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Ms. Eshoo.
Am I unmuted? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Well, it's still, we're Californian, so it's good morning for us. I want to start by saying that content moderation, like removing posts or banning accounts, is about treating symptoms. And I think that we need to treat symptoms, but I also think that we need to address two underlying diseases. The first is that your products amplify extremism. The second is that your business models of targeted ads enable misinformation to thrive because you chase user engagement at great costs to our society. So to Mr. Pichai, last month the Anti-Defamation League found that YouTube amplifies extremism. Scores of journalists and researchers agree. And here's what they say happens. A user watching an extremist video is often recommended more such videos, slowly radicalizing the user. YouTube is not doing enough to address recommendations, and it's why Representative Malachowski and myself introduced the Protecting Americans from Dangerous Algorithms Act to narrowly amend Section 230 so courts can examine the role of algorithmic amplification that leads to violence. And it's also why I, along with 40 of my House colleagues, wrote to each of you about this issue. And Mr. Chairman, I asked that those letters be placed into the record. So my question to you, Mr. Pichai, is, are you willing to overhaul YouTube's core recommendation engine to correct this issue? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, we have overhauled our recommendation systems, and I know you've engaged on these issues before, pretty substantially in pretty much any area.
Mr. Pichai, yes or no? Because we still have a huge problem. And I outlined what are you saying that the Anti-Defamation League doesn't know what they're talking about? All these journalists and researchers, there is a lot more to address. And that's why I'm asking you if you're willing to overhaul YouTube's core recommendation engine to correct this. It's serious, it's dangerous. What more can I say about it? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, if I may explain, we have
I don't have time to explain. So let me just say this to the witnesses. We don't do filibuster in the House. That's something that's done in the Senate. So filibuster doesn't work with us. To Mr. Zuckerberg, your algorithms use unseemly amounts of data to keep users on your platform because that leads to more ad revenue. Now, businesses are in business to make money. We all understand that. but your model has a cost to society. The most engaging posts are often those that induce fear, anxiety, anger, and that includes deadly misinformation. The Center for Countering Digital Hate found that the Explore and suggested parts of Instagram are littered with COVID misinformation, election disinformation, and QAnon posts. So this is dangerous, and it's why Representative Schakowsky and I are doing a bill that is going to ban this business model of surveillance advertising. So are you willing to redesign your products to eliminate your focus on addicting users to your platforms at all costs? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, as I said before, the teams that design our algorithms and especially
let me just say this, and I think it's irritating all of us, and that is that no one seems to know the word yes or the word no. Which one is it? If you don't want to answer, just say I don't want to answer. So yes or no?
Congresswoman, these are nuanced issues.
Okay, so I'm going to say that's a no. To Mr. Dorsey, as the chairwoman of the Health Subcommittee, I think that you need to eliminate all COVID misinformation and not label or reduce its spread, but remove it. I looked at a tweet this morning. Robert Kennedy Jr. Links the death of baseball legend Hank Aaron to the COVID vaccine, even though fact checkers debunked the story. The tweet has 9,000 retweets. Will you take this down, and why haven't you? And also, why haven't you banned the 12 accounts that are spewing its deadly COVID misinformation? This could cost lives.
No, we won't take it down because it didn't violate our policy. So we have a clear policy in place.
What kind of policy is that? Is it a policy for misinformation?
No.
Gentle lady's time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Scalise. Is Mr. Scalise here?
Thank you.
There we go,
thank you,
Steve.
Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for having this here. I want to thank our three witnesses for coming as well. Clearly, you're seeing a lot of concern being expressed by members on both sides, both Republican and Democrat, about the way that your social media platforms are run, and especially as it relates to the fairness and equal treatment of people. I know I've had a lot of concerns, shared it with some of you individually over the last few years about whether it's algorithms that seem to be designed sometimes to have an anti-bias against conservatives. But look, we all agree that whether it's illegal activity, bullying, those things ought not be permeated through social media. But there's a big difference between stopping bullying and violent type of social media posts versus actual censorship of political views that you disagree with. And I think I want to ask my first question to Mr. Dorsey, because there have been a lot of concerns expressed recently about that unequal treatment. And I'll just start with the New York Post article. I think a lot of people have seen this. This article was censored by Twitter when it was originally sent out. This is the New York Post, which is a newspaper that goes back to 1801, founded by Alexander Hamilton. And for weeks, this very credibly sourced article right before an election about Hunter Biden was banned by Twitter. And then when you contrast that, you have this Washington Post article that was designed to misportray a conversation between President Trump and the Georgia Secretary of State. Since parts of this have been debunked, and yet this article can still be tweeted out. I want to ask Mr. Dorsey, first of all, do you recognize that there is this real concern that there's an anti-conservative bias on Twitter's behalf? And would you recognize that this has to stop if this is going to be, Twitter is going to be viewed by both sides as a place where everybody's going to get a fair treatment?
Yeah, we made a total mistake with the New York Post. We corrected that within 24 hours. It was not to do with the content. It was to do with a hacked materials policy. We had an incorrect interpretation. We don't write policy according to any particular political leaning. If we find any of it, we route it out.
So regarding the Washington Post,
we will make mistakes, and our goal is to correct them as quickly as possible. And in that case, we did.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate you recognizing that was a mistake. However, the New York Post entire Twitter account was blocked for about 2 weeks, where they couldn't send anything out, not just that article. And to censor, we've got a First Amendment too. It just seems like to censor a newspaper that's as highly respected as the New York Post, again, 1801, founded by Alexander Hamilton, for their entire account to be blocked for 2 weeks by a mistake, seems like a really big mistake. Was anyone held accountable in your censoring department for that mistake?
Well, we don't have a censoring department, but I agree.
Who made the decision then to block their account for 2 weeks?
We didn't block their account for 2 weeks. We required them to delete the tweet, and then they could tweet it again. They didn't take that action, so we corrected it for them. Even though
the tweet was accurate. I mean, are you now, look, you've seen the conversations on both sides about Section 230, and there's going to be more discussion about it, but you're acting as a publisher. If you're telling a newspaper that they've got to delete something in order for them to be able to participate in your account, I mean, don't you recognize that you're no longer hosting a town square? You're acting as a publisher when you do that.
It was literally just a process error. This was not against them in any particular way. We require, if we remove a violation, we require people to correct it. We change that based on they're not wanting to delete that tweet, which I completely agree with. I see it, but it is something we learn.
Okay, well, let me go to the New York. Now let me go to the Washington Post article, because this article can still be tweeted. I don't know if it was ever taken down. It contains false information. Even the Washington Post acknowledges that it contains false information. Yet their tweets today on your service that still mischaracterize it in a way where even the Washington Post admitted it's wrong. Yet those mischaracterizations can still be retweeted. Will you address that and start taking those down to reflect what even the Washington Post themselves has admitted as is false information?
Our misleading information policies are focused on manipulated media, public health, and civic integrity. That's it. We don't have a general.
Well, I would hope that you would go and take that down. And look, I know you said in your opening statement, Mr. Dorsey, that Twitter is running a business, and you said, quote, a business wants to grow its customer, the customers it serves. Just recognize, if you become viewed, continue to become viewed as an anti-conservatively biased platform, there will be other people that step up to compete and ultimately take millions of people from Twitter. I would hope you recognize that, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Butterfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, last year, in response to the police killing of George Floyd, you wrote a post on your Facebook page that denounced racial bias. It proclaimed Black Lives Matter. You also announced that the company would donate $10 million to racial justice organizations. And Mr. Dorsey, Twitter changed its official bio to a Black Lives Matter tribute, and you pledged $3 million to an anti-racism organization started by Colin Kaepernick. And Mr. Pichai, your company held a company-wide moment of silence to honor George Floyd, and you announced $12 million in grants to racial justice organizations. The CEO of Google subsidiary YouTube wrote in a blog post, quote, "We believe Black Lives Matter and we all need to do more to dismantle systemic racism," end of quote. YouTube also announced it would start a $100 million fund for Black creators. Now, all of this sounds nice, but these pronouncements, gentlemen, these pronouncements and money donations do not address the way your company's own products, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, have been successfully weaponized by racists and are being used to undermine social justice movements, to suppress voting in communities of color, and spread racist content and lies. And so, gentlemen, in my view, your companies have contributed to the spread of race-based extremism and voter suppression. As the New York Times noted last year, it's as if the heads of McDonald's, Burger King, and Taco Bell all got together to fight obesity by donating to a vegan food co-op rather than lowering their calories, end of quote. Gentlemen, you could have made meaningful changes within your organizations to address the racial biases built into your products and donated to these organizations. But instead, we are left with platitudes and another round of passing the buck. America is watching you today. This is a moment that begins a transformation of the way you do business, and you must understand that. Perhaps a lack of diversity within your organizations has contributed to these failures. The Congressional Black Caucus's Tech 2025 initiative has been working for years to increase diversity and equity in tech companies at all levels, and you know that because we have visited with you in California. We founded this initiative in 2015 with the hope that by now the tech workforce would reflect the diversity of our country. Here we are, 2021. I acknowledge that you've made some modest advancements, but not enough. There must be meaningful representation in your companies to design your products and services in ways that work for all Americans. And that requires public accountability. History has shown that you have talked the talk, but have failed to walk the walk. It appears now that Congress will have to compel you, perhaps with penalties, to make meaningful changes. And I'm going to try the yes or no answer, and hopefully I will have better results than my colleagues. Mr. Zuckerberg, I'll start with you, and please be brief, yes or no. Would you oppose legislation that would require technology companies to publicly report on workforce diversity at all levels?
Congressman, I don't think so, but I need to understand it in more detail.
Well, we have talked about that, and I hope that if we introduce this legislation, you will not oppose it. What about you, Mr. Dorsey? Would you oppose a law that made workforce diversity reporting a requirement?
No, I wouldn't oppose it. It does come with some complications in that we don't always have all the demographic data for our employees.
Well, thank you for that. And we talked with you in your office some years ago, and you made a commitment to work with us, but we need more. What about you, Mr. Pichai? Are you willing to support? Well, would you be willing to commit would you oppose a law that made workforce diversity reporting a requirement? Would you oppose it?
Congressman, we were the first company to publish transparency reports. We publish it annually, and so happy to share that with you and take any feedback. But we do today provide in the U.S. Detailed demographic information on our workforce, and we are committed to doing better.
Well, gentlemen, for the last 6 years, the Congressional Black Caucus has said to you over and over again, we need greater diversity among your workforce from the top to the bottom, and we need for you to publish the data so the world can see it. That's the only way we're going to deal with diversity and equity. Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. I heard you at the beginning of the committee gavel, and I yield back the 10 seconds that I have.
Gentleman deserves commendation for doing that, and I hope others follow his example. Chair now recognizes Mr. Guthrie for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. And, you know, big tech decisions have real impact on people. And that's why I ask my constituents using your platforms to share their experiences on your platforms with me as their representative. And I'm here to advocate on their behalf. I received 450 responses, and one major thing that I heard from my constituents was the experience they've had with sites taking down religious content, which is important because there's a lot of religious organizations are now streaming their services due to COVID. I did have one instance where a constituent wrote to me, quote, and this is what she posted: "I am thankful God's grace is new every morning." And then Facebook took it down. And then my constituent said she got a notice from Facebook that it violated their policies around hate. And so I just want to discuss about this. I could ask you yes or no questions, Mr. Zuckerberg, on that. But I just want to talk about it a little bit. One, it just seems, I know that we don't want extreme language on the internet. I'm with you on that. And you can't watch everything. And so you use algorithms to find that. So algorithms will flag things, some that are clearly obvious and some that you would say probably shouldn't have been flagged. But it seems to me that it seems to be biased in that direction. And so instead of just giving you a yes or no question, I want to read that quote again. And I sort of know a little bit about math, not a lot, but a little bit, about within that quote, what in there would get tripped up, and would this quote get tripped up and put into the flag category? And as it says, "I am thankful God's grace is new every morning." And so I guess the question is, what word or thought do you think would trip an algorithm for that quote, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Congressman, it is not clear to me why that post would be a problem. I would need to look into it in more detail. Sometimes the systems look at patterns of posting. So if someone is posting a lot, then maybe our system thinks it's spam. But I would need to look into it in more detail. Overall, the reality is that any system is going to make mistakes. There's going to be content that we take down that we should have left up, and there's going to be content that we missed that we should have taken down that we didn't catch, or that the system's made a mistake on. And at scale, unfortunately, those mistakes can be a large number, even if it's a very small percent. But I think that's why when we're talking about things like Section 230 reform, I think it is reasonable to expect large companies to have effective moderation systems, but not reasonable to expect that there are never any errors. But I think that transparency can help hold the companies accountable as to what accuracy and effectiveness they're achieving.
Okay, well, to your spam comment, I think they did receive a notification that was for the hate policy. So, and I understand there's going to be gray areas, whatever, but that quote, I don't see where the gray areas, how it could get caught up in that. But I want to move on. Thanks for your answer with that. I want to move on. So, Mr. Dorsey, I want to talk about the RFK Jr. I didn't see that quote, but you said that didn't violate your policy. And just in the context of that, I know CDC just recently updated its school guidance to make clear science says you can be 3 feet away and still be safe in schools. Things are changing every day because we're learning more and more about this virus. So how did the RFK comment not violate your policy and RFK Jr. and how did we have a RFK 3 that we all JPK 3 I guess we all like and as a former colleague, but RFK Jr. and the policy towards that and then how do you keep up with what's changing so quickly, Mr. Dorsey?
Yeah, we can follow up with you on the exact reasoning, but we have to recognize that our policies evolve constantly, and they have to evolve constantly. So, as has been said earlier in this testimony, we observe what's happening as a result of our policy. We try to understand the ramifications, and we improve it. And it's a constant cycle. We're always looking to improve our policies and our enforcement.
So, Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Bachar, just on all the continuously evolving information on COVID, because we're learning more and more about it, and how do you keep up? Well, only about 30 seconds, so if you could, quick answers for each of you, if you can. Mr. Bachar, maybe, since you haven't answered the question.
On COVID, we've been really taking guidance from CDC and other health experts, proactively removing information. One thing we get to do in YouTube is to recommend higher quality content. We have shown over 400 billion information panels on COVID alone last year, including a lot from CDC and other health organizations.
Okay, thank you. And I'll yield back 4 seconds, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Guthrie. Chair now recognizes Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing today. Today, we have another opportunity to hear from the leaders of Facebook, Twitter, and Google. In what has become a concerning pattern, the members of this committee are here to demand answers to questions about social media's role in escalating misinformation, extremism, and violence. Last week, I testified at a House Judiciary Committee hearing about the rise in discrimination and violence against Asian Americans. Horrifically, that hearing came on the heels of a violent attack in Atlanta that left 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women, dead. The issues we are discussing here are not abstract. They have real-world consequences and implications that are too often measured in human lives. I'm worried, as are many watching this hearing, that the companies before us today are not doing enough to prevent the spread of hate, especially when it's targeted against minority communities. Clearly, the current approach is not working, and I believe Congress must revisit Section 230. A recent study from the University of San Francisco examined nearly 700,000 tweets in the week before and after President Trump tweeted the phrase Chinese virus. The results showed 2 alarming trends. There was a significantly greater increase in hate speech the week after the president's tweet, and that half of the tweets using the hashtag China virus showed an anti-Asian sentiment compared to just 1/5 of the tweets using the hashtag COVID-19. This empirical evidence backs up what the World Health Organization already knew in 2015, saying disease names really do matter. We've seen certain disease names provoke a backlash against members of particularly religious or ethnic communities. Despite this, Facebook and Twitter are still allowing hashtags like China virus, Kung flu, and Wuhan virus to spread. Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, given the clear association between this type of language and racism and violence, why do you still allow these hashtags on your platforms? Anyone answer that, or is that not answerable?
I think we're waiting for you to call on one of us. We do have policies against hateful conduct, and that includes the trends. So when we see it associated with any hateful conduct, we will take action on it. It's useful to remember that a lot of these hashtags, though, do contain counter speech, and people on the other side of it do own them and show why this is so terrible and why it needs to stop.
Could I just take my time back? The fact of the matter is I think you know how to develop algorithms to kind of get rid of this and examine this further. Mr. Zuckerberg, any comment here?
Thanks, Congresswoman. The rise in anti-Asian hate is a really big issue and something that I do think that we need to be proactive about. I agree with the comments that Jack made on this. Any on Facebook, any of that context, if it's combined with something that's clearly hateful, we will take that down. It violates the hate speech policy. But one of the nuances that Jack highlighted that we certainly see as well in enforcing hate speech policies is that we need to be clear about when someone is saying something because they're using it in a hateful way versus when they're denouncing it. And this is one of the things that has made it more difficult to operationalize this at scale.
An opportunity to really look at hate speech, what it really means, particularly in this day and age when we have many instances of these things happening. Hate speech on social media can be baked in. And unfortunately, this also is a trend that maybe happened years and years ago, which it might have just been a latent situation. But with social media, it travels all around the world and it hurts a lot of people. And my feeling, and I believe a lot of other people's feeling, is that we really have to look at how we define hate speech. And, you all are very brilliant people and you hire brilliant people. I would think that there is a way for you to examine this further and take it one step lower to see if it is something that is legitimate or not. And I really feel that this is a time, especially now when we're examining platforms and what you can do and should do. And as we're examining here in this committee, and as we write legislation, we really want to have the entire multitude of what can and can't be done. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I only have 11 seconds left and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Let's see. The chair now recognizes Mr. Kinzinger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. In all this conversation, it's good to have. I think we also have to recognize that we're lucky to have all these companies located in the United States. When we talked about the issues and concerns, for instance, with TikTok, we can see that a lot of these companies could easily leave here and go elsewhere, and then we would have far less oversight. I think the crackdown on January 6th was correct. I think we need to be careful to not use that as a way to deflect from, what led to January 6th, pushing of this narrative of stop the steal. I think there are folks that are concerned, though, that we also need to make sure that those same levels of protection exist when you talk about like Iran, for instance, and what the leaders there tweet. But let me go into specific questions. So over the years, we've obviously seen the rise of disinformation. It's not new. I remember getting disinformation in the 90s, but we've seen it spread on these platforms. So we live in a digital world where many people get their news and entertainment from the internet, from articles and posts that are often based off algorithms that can cater to what people see and read. So with those constant news feeds that simply reinforce people's beliefs, or worse, that they can promote disgraceful and utterly ridiculous conspiracy theories from groups like QAnon Extremism and violence have grown exponentially as a result. We know it's true specifically after January 6th. So, Mr. Zuckerberg, let me ask you, according to Haney Farid at Berkeley, numerous external studies and some of your own internal studies have revealed that your algorithms are actively promoting divisive, hateful, and conspiratorial content because it engages users to spend more time. Do you think those studies are wrong? And if not, what are you guys doing to reverse course on that?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. This is an important set of topics. In terms of groups, we stopped recommending all civic and political groups, even though I think a lot of the civic and political groups are healthy, because we were seeing that was one vector that there might be polarization or extremism, and groups might start off with one set of views, but migrate to another place. So we removed that completely, and we did it first as an exceptional measure during the election. And since the election, we've announced that we're going to extend that policy indefinitely. For the rest of the content in Newsfeed and on Instagram, the main thing that I'd say is I do think that there's quite a bit of misperception about how our algorithms work and what we optimize for. I've heard a lot of people say that we're optimizing for keeping people on the service. The way that we view this is that we are trying to help people have meaningful social interactions. People come to social networks to be able to connect with people. If we deliver that value, then it will be natural that people use our services more. But that's very different from setting up algorithms in order to just kind of try to tweak and optimize and get people to spend every last minute on our service, which is not how we design the company or the services.
Thanks. I don't mean to interrupt you. I do have another question. Mr. Chairman, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record an article from the Wall Street Journal titled Facebook Executives Shut Down Efforts to Make the Site Less Divisive. Let me move on to the next one. For years, I've called for increased consumer protection from companies on fake accounts and bad actors who use them to exploit others. This issue affected me personally. In 2015, a woman from India spent all of her money on a flight to come see me because she claimed to have developed a relationship with me over Facebook. In 2019, I sent you, Mr. Zuckerberg, a letter highlighting the issue, and your team provided a relatively inadequate response. Since then, I've introduced this two pieces of legislation: Social Media Accountability and Account Verification Act and the Social Media Fraud Mitigation Act, both of which aim to curb this activity. So, Mr. Zuckerberg, the last time you came before us, you stated that Facebook has a responsibility to protect its users. Do you feel that your company is living up to that? And further, what have you done to remove those fake accounts?
Thanks. So fake accounts are one of the bigger integrity issues that we face. I think in the first half in the last half of last year, I think we took down more than 1 billion fake accounts, just to give you a sense of the volume, although most of those our systems are able to identify within seconds or minutes of them signing up, because the accounts just don't behave in a way that a normal person would in using the service. But this is certainly one of the highest priority issues we have. We see a large prevalence of it. Our systems, I think at this point, are pretty effective in fighting it, but they're not perfect, and there are still a few percent that get through, and it's a big issue and one that we'll continue working on.
Thank you. I'd love to ask the others the question, but I don't have time, so I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Ms. Taster for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, since you were last here in front of the committee, the illegal activity, the surveillance of unwitting Americans, the rampant misinformation on your platforms have gotten worse. Part of the reason for this toxic stew is that you employ manipulative methods to keep people cemented to the platform, often amplifying discord, and it boosts your bottom line. You enjoy an outdated liability shield that incentivizes you to look the other way or take half measures, while you make billions at the expense of our kids, our health, the truth, and now we've seen the very foundation of our democracy. I've been working for over a year with advocates and other members on an update to the children's protections online. You all know that tracking and manipulation of children under age 13 is against the law. But Facebook, Google, YouTube, and other platforms have broken that law or have found ways around it. Many have been sanctioned for knowingly and illegally harvesting personal information of children and profiting from it. I have a question for each of you. It's a quick yes or no. Did you all watch The Social Dilemma, where former employees of yours or other big tech platforms say they do not allow their kids on social media? Mr. Zuckerberg?
Congresswoman, I haven't seen it,
Yes.
but I'm obviously familiar with it.
Yes, sir. Okay. Mr. Pichai, yes or no?
Yes, I've seen the movie.
And
No.
okay, well, Mr. Zuckerberg, there's a good reason that they have the former execs say that. Are you aware of the 2019 Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics study that the risk of depression for adolescents rises with each daily hour spent on social media? And I'm not talking screen time. I'm not talking about FaceTime or sending text messages to friends. But are you aware of that research?
Congresswoman, I'm not aware of that research.
All right. What about the 2019 HHS research that suicide rates among kids aged 10 to 14 increased by 56% between 2007 and 2017 and tripled for kids between the age of 10 and 14? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, I'm aware of the issues.
So yes, certainly you are also aware of the research that indicates a correlation between the rise in hospital admissions for self-harm and the prevalence of social media on phones and the apps on platforms that are designed to be addictive and keep kids hooked. Yes? Well, how about you, Mr. Pichai? Are you aware of the JAMA Pediatrics September 2020 study where they tested hundreds of apps used by children age 5 and under, many of which were in the Google Play Store's family section? The study found 67% of the apps tested showed transmission of identifying info to third parties in violation of the COPPA law. Are you familiar?
Extensively spent time on this area. We introduced a curated set of apps for kids on the Play Store. We give digital well-being tools so that people can take a break, set time, parents can set time limits for children.
Let me ask you this then, Mr. Pichai. How much are you making in advertising revenue from children under the age 13?
Most of our products, other than a specific product designed for kids in YouTube, most of our products are not eligible for children under the age of 13.
So you're not going to provide that. Mr. Zuckerberg, how much advertising revenue does Facebook, do you make from behavioral surveillance advertising targeted towards kids under age 13?
Congresswoman, it should be none of it. We don't allow children under the age of 13 on any of the services that run advertising.
Oh, are you saying that there are no kids on Instagram under the age of 13 right now?
Congresswoman, children under the age of 13 are not allowed on Instagram.
Well, that's
we find out that they're there, we
I think
remove them.
it's, of course, every parent knows that there are kids under the age of 13 on Instagram. And the problem is that you know it, and you know that the brain and social development of our kids is still evolving at a young age. There are reasons in the law that we set that cutoff at 13. But now, because these platforms have ignored it, they've profited off of it, we're going to strengthen the law. And I encourage all of my colleagues to join in this effort. I've heard a lot of bipartisan support here today. We also need to hold the corporate executives accountable and give parents the tools that they need to take care and protect their kids. Thank you.
General Lady, time is expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. You know, over a decade ago, Americans watched Facebook, Twitter, and Google emerge from humble beginnings. We were curious to see how these new innovative companies would improve our lives. The results are in, and they're deeply concerning. We've seen a surge in cyberbullying, child porn, radical extremism, human trafficking, suicides, and screen addiction, all of which have been linked to the use of social media. Our nation's political discourse has never been uglier, and we haven't been this divided since the Civil War. Yet, big tech marches on uninhibited. What's their newest target? children under the age of 13. News outlets this week have reported that Facebook is planning to create an Instagram app designed for children under the age of 13. We've talked about it here already today. Elementary and middle school students. By allowing big tech to operate under Section 230 as is, we'll be allowing these companies to get our children hooked on their destructive products for their own profit. Big tech is essentially handing our children a lit cigarette and hoping they stay addicted for life. You know, in 1994, Democratic Congressman Henry Waxman chaired a hearing with the CEOs of our nation's largest tobacco companies. During his opening statement, he stated, and I quote, "Sadly, this deadly habit begins with our kids. In many cases, they become hooked quickly and develop a lifelong addiction that is nearly impossible to break." So, Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, you profit from your companies hooking users to your platforms by capitalizing on their time. So, yes or no? Do you agree that you make money off of creating an addiction to your platforms, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Congressman, no, I don't agree with that.
Thank
what
you.
we do
Thank
is
you. That's what I needed, a yes or a no, because you do. Mr. Dorsey?
No.
Okay. All right. Let me go on. Mr. Chairman Waxman went on to say, and I quote, "For decades, the tobacco companies have been exempt from the standards of responsibility and accountability that apply to all other American corporations. Companies that sell aspirin, cars, and soda are all held to strict standards when they cause harm, and that we demand that when problems occur, corporations and their senior executives be accountable to Congress and the public. This hearing marks the beginning of a new relationship between Congress and the tobacco companies." That's what Chairman Waxman said in 1994. So for all three of you, Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Dorsey, and Mr. Pichai, do you agree that as the CEOs of major tech companies, you should be held accountable to Congress and the public? Mr. Zuckerberg.
Congressman, I think we are accountable to Congress and to the public.
Do you think you should be held accountable?
I'm not sure. I'm sure I understand what you mean, but I think so.
Question: should you be held accountable to Congress and the public for the way you run your business?
Yes, and we are.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Dorsey.
Yes, accountable to the public.
Okay. Accountable. Well, no, I said accountable to Congress and the public. We represent the public. So you agree?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Pichai.
Yes, I'm here today because I'm accountable to Congress and members of the public.
Okay, great. Well, gentlemen, let me tell you this, and I think I've heard it mentioned by several of my other colleagues. There's a lot of smugness among you. There's this air of untouchableness in your responses to many of the tough questions that you're being asked. So let me tell you all this. All of these concerns that Chairman Waxman stated in 1994 about big tobacco apply to my concerns about big tech today, about your companies. It is now public knowledge that former Facebook executives have admitted that they use the tobacco industry's playbook for addictive products. And while this is not your first hearing in front of Congress, I can assure you that this hearing marks a new relationship between all of us here today. There will be accountability. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. He yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chair for organizing this hearing, and I thank the participants. This is a lot of work on your behalf and a long day for you. I appreciate that. You're all aware that your platforms are behemoths and that the Americans are demanding that we step in and rein in your platforms, both in terms of how you handle our data and how your platforms handle disinformation that causes real harm to Americans and to the democracy itself. I understand the tension you have between maximizing your profits by engaging to your platforms on the one hand, and by the need to address disinformation and real harm it causes on the other hand. Your unwillingness to unambiguously commit to enforcing your own policies and removing the 12 most egregious spreaders of vaccine disinformation from your platforms gets right at what I'm concerned about. Disinformation is a strong driver for engagement, and consequently, you too often don't act, even though we know you have the resources to do that. There are real harms associated with this. And my questions, I hope I don't appear to be rude, but when I ask for a yes or no question, I will insist on a yes or no answer. Mr. Zuckerberg, yes or no, do you acknowledge that there is disinformation being spread on your platform?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, there is, and we take steps to fight it.
Thank you. Yes or no, do you agree that your company has profited from the spread of disinformation?
Congressman, I don't agree with that. People don't want to see disinformation on our services, and when we do, I think it hurts our long-term business.
You said you don't agree with that. I appreciate your forthrightness on that. But we all know this is happening. Profits are being generated from COVID-19 and vaccine disinformation, election disinformation, QAnon conspiracy theories, just to name a few things. And it's baffling that you have a negative answer to that question. Approximately, well, let's move on to the next issue. Mr. Zuckerberg, you talk a lot about relying on third-party fact checkers to combat the spread of disinformation, but you tell us very little about the process. I wrote you a letter nearly 2 years ago asking about it, and you failed to answer my question. I asked this question again when an executive from your company testified last year, and she failed to answer it. I'd like to get an answer today. On average, from the time content is posted to Facebook's platform, how long does it take Facebook to flag suspicious content to third-party fact checkers, for third-party fact checkers to review the content, and for Facebook to take remedial action after this review is completed? How long does this entire process take? I'm just looking for a quick number.
Congressman, it can vary. If an AI system identifies something immediately, it can be within seconds. If we have to wait for people to report it to us and have human review, it can take hours or days. The fact checkers take as much time as they need to review things, but as soon as we get an answer back from them, we should operationalize that and attach a label if the content is rated false and reduce the
I understand what you're saying, but what I do know is that this process isn't happening quickly enough. And I'm very concerned that you aren't motivated to speak things up, because most problematic content is what gets the most views. And the longer the content stays up, the more this helps maximize your bottom line and the more harm that it can cause. It's clear that you aren't going to make these changes on your own. This is a question for all of the participants, panelists. Would you oppose legislation that prohibits placing ads next to what you know to be or should know to be false or misleading information, including ads that are placed in videos, promoted content, and ads that are placed above, below, or on the side of a piece of content? Mr. Zuckerberg, would you answer with a yes or no first, please?
Congressman, that's very nuanced. I think the questions to determine whether something is misinformation is a process that I think would need to be spelled out well in a law like that.
Well, okay, I appreciate that. Mr. Dorsey?
Yes, I would oppose it until we see the actual requirements and what the ramifications are. We need to understand that.
Okay. Mr. Pichai, would you oppose the prohibition like this?
The principle makes sense. In fact, advertisers don't want anywhere near to be content like that. And so we already have incentives. You can imagine reputable advertisers like consumer products advertisers do not want any ads to appear next to information that could turn off their consumers. So we have natural incentives to do the right thing here.
Okay, you all say you want a safe and open platform for everyone. You say it's not in your company's interest to have disinformation on your platform, so you shouldn't oppose efforts that would prevent harming American people. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Long for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pichai, I'm going to ask you a yes or no question. And just tell me if you know the difference in these two words. Yes and no.
Yes.
Mr. Zuckerberg, same question for you. Do you know the difference in yes and no?
Yes, Congressman.
And Mr. Dorsey, same question for you. Do you know the difference in two words, yes or no?
Yes.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
Yes, I didn't hear.
I know the difference.
Okay, thank you. I won a steak dinner there from one of my colleagues. They didn't think I could get you all to answer. All three of you to answer yes or no question. I did it. Mr. Zuckerberg, let me ask you, how do you ascertain if a user is under 13 years old?
Congressman, on services like Facebook, we have people put in a birthday when they register.
That's handy. So a 13-year-old would never, an 11-year-old would never put in the wrong birth date by 2 years and say they were 13. Is that kind of your policy?
Congressman, it's more nuanced than that, but I think you're getting at a real point, which is that people lie. And we have additional systems that try to determine what someone's age might be. So if we detect that someone might be under the age of 13, even if they lied, we kick them off. But this is part of the reason why we're exploring having a service for Instagram that allows under 13s on, because we worry that kids may find ways to try to lie and evade some of our systems. But if we create a safe system where that has appropriate parent controls, then we might be able to get people into using that instead. We're still early in figuring this out, but that's a big part of the theory and what we're hoping to do here.
But currently, they're not allowed to use Instagram, correct?
That's correct. Our policies do not allow people under the age of 13 to use it.
I'm from Missouri, the Show Me state, and just to say that no one under 13 could get on, to me, doesn't pass the Missouri smell test of Show Me. So, sticking with you, Mr. Zuckerberg, you created the Facebook Oversight Board as a way to help hold Facebook accountable. They are currently looking at Facebook's decision to remove President Trump's Facebook account. If the Oversight Board determines that Facebook should have left President Trump's account up, what will you do?
Congressman, we will respect the decision of the Oversight Board, and if they tell us that former President Trump's account should be reinstated, then we will honor that.
I don't know why people call Attorney General Ashcroft Attorney General, but when they speak of President Trump, they don't call him former president. But I guess I'll leave that for another day. Sticking with you again, Mr. Zuckerberg, it's my understanding is that Facebook Oversight Board is comprised of members from all over the world. As you're well aware, the United States has the strictest protections on free speech than any other country. Since the decisions of the board are being made by a panel rather than the U.S. Court of Law, how can you assure members of this committee and the American people that the Oversight Board will uphold free speech and make their decisions based on American laws and principles?
Congressman, the members of the Oversight Board were selected because of their views on free expression and strong support of it. That's why we created the Oversight Board, to help us defend these principles and to help us balance the different aspects of human rights, including free expression. But each of the people on the Oversight Board was selected because of a strong commitment to free expression. I think the decisions that the Oversight Board has made so far reflect that.
Okay, let me move on to Mr. Dorsey. Mr. Dorsey, I know you're from the Show Me state also. Have you been vaccinated against COVID-19?
Not yet.
Mr. Pichai, have you been vaccinated against COVID-19?
Sorry, I missed the question, Congressman.
Have you? I know I bore a lot of people. Have you been vaccinated against COVID-19?
Congressman, I was very fortunate to have received it last week.
So you have one shot, you have another one to go, or is it just Johnson & Johnson, or you just need one?
I still have one more shot to go.
And Mr. Zuckerberg, same question. Have you been vaccinated against COVID-19?
I have not yet, but hope to as soon as possible.
Okay. It's not a personal preference not to get vaccinated. You just haven't got to your age group, or?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. And I just cannot believe Robert Kennedy Jr. is out there with his anti-vax stuff, and it's allowed to stay up on Twitter. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Let's see who's next. I don't see a name. Can staff show us who's next? Mr. Welch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What we're hearing from both sides of the aisle are enormous concerns about some of the consequences of the development of social media, the algorithmic amplification of disinformation, election interference, privacy issues, the destruction of local news, and also some competition issues. And I have listened carefully, and each of the executives has said that your companies are attempting to face these issues. But a concern I have is whether, when the public interest is so affected by these decisions and by these developments, ultimately, should these decisions be made by private executives who are accountable to shareholders, or should they be made by elected representatives accountable to voters? So I really have two questions that I'd like each of you, starting with Mr. Zuckerberg and then Mr. Pichai and then Mr. Dorsey, to address. First, do you agree that many of these decisions that are about matters that so profoundly affect the public interest, should they be made exclusively by private actors like yourselves who have responsibilities for these major enterprises? And secondly, as a way forward to help us resolve these issues or work with them, would you support the creation by Congress of a public agency, one like the Federal Trade Commission or the Securities and Exchange Commission, one that had staff that's expert in policy and technology, it has rulemaking and enforcement authority, to be an ongoing representative of the public to address these emerging issues? Mr. Zuckerberg.
Congressman, I agree with what you're saying, and I've said a number of times that I think that private companies should not be making so many decisions alone that have to balance these complicated social and public equities. And I think that the solution that you're talking about could be very effective and positive for helping out, because what we've seen in different countries is around the world is there are lots of different public equities at stake here: free expression, safety, privacy, competition, and these things trade off against each other. And I think a lot of these questions and the reason why people get upset at the companies, I don't think it's necessarily because the companies are negligent. I think it's because these are complex trade-offs between these different equities. And if you
pardon my interruption, but I want to go to Mr. Pichai, but thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg.
Congressman, if your question is, I just want to make sure, are you asking about whether there should be another agency? I defer to Congress on that. We are definitely subject to a variety of statutes and oversight by agencies like FTC. We have consent decree agreements with FCC, and we engage with these agencies regularly.
But do you believe that it should be up to the public as opposed to private interests to be making decisions about these public effects?
We definitely think areas where there could be clear legislation informed by the public. I think that definitely is a better approach. I would say the nature of content is so fast changing and so dynamic. You know, we spend a lot of area hiring experts, consult with third parties, and that expertise is needed, I think, based on the
right.
nature
And
of
that's the problem we have in Congress, because an issue pops up and there's no way we can keep up with it. You all can barely keep up with it yourself. Mr. Dorsey, your view on those two questions, please.
Yes, I don't think the decision should be made by private companies or the government, which is why we're suggesting a protocol approach to help the people make the decisions themselves, have more control themselves.
So does that mean that the creation of an agency that would be intended to address many of these tech issues that are emerging is something you'd oppose or not?
Well, I always have an open mind. I want to see the details of what that means and how it works in practice.
Well, of course. But the heart of it is creating an entity that has to address these questions of algorithmic transparency, of algorithmic amplification, of hate speech, of disinformation, of competition and to have an agency that's dedicated to that, much like the Security Exchange Commission was designed to stop the rampant abuse on Wall Street in the 30s. A public sector entity that is doing this, not just leaving it to private companies.
I do think there should be more regulation around the primitives of AI, but we focus a lot of our conversations right now on the outcomes of it. I don't think we're looking enough at the primitives.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Bashan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. It's going to be a long day, and appreciate your testimony and your answering questions. I do think it's important to understand history. Excuse me, when you look at these situations, and when it comes to the political side, when Thomas Jefferson wanted to get out an anti-Adams message, even though he was his own vice president, he started his own newspaper because it was pretty clear that the newspapers that were being published weren't going to change their view because there was no competitive reason to do that. And I think we're looking at potentially a similar situation here. Without competition, things don't change. I mean, it'd be interesting to know the conversations with John D. Rockefeller in the early 1900s, prior to the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911, and then of course AT&T in 1982. So I understand that these are businesses; they're publicly held companies. I respect that. I understand that. I'm a capitalist. That said, these situations are a little different, I think, because there's some social responsibility here, and I appreciate your answers that your companies are doing what you believe are necessary. But so I want to add, I'm going to take the antitrust angle here, Mr. Punchai. What do you think? What's the situation when you have Google? 92% of the searches are Google. You basically can't get on the internet without some sort of Google service. What do you think? What do you think is going to happen? What do you think we should do about that?
Congressman, we definitely are engaged with conversations as well as lawsuits in certain cases. We understand there will be scrutiny here. We are a popular general purpose search engine, but we compete vigorously in many of the markets we operate in. For example, majority of our revenue comes from product searches, and 1 in 2 product searches originate with Amazon today in the US. So we definitely see a lot of competition by category. There are many areas as a company, we are an emerging player, be it making phones or when we are trying to provide enterprise software, we compete with other larger players as well. And if you look at last year and look at all the new entrants in the market, new companies that have gone public and emerged strongly, in tech shows that the market is vibrant and dynamic. As Google, we have invested in many startups. Googlers have started former Google employees have started over 2,000 companies in the past 15 years. And so, I see a highly dynamic, vibrant, competitive tech sector, and we are committed to doing our part.
Okay, fair enough. Mr. Zuckerberg, do you have some comments on that subject?
Congressman, I would echo Sundar's comments. I think that this is a highly competitive market. I mean, if this is a meeting about social media, not only do you have the different companies that are here today that all offer very big services that compete with each other, but you have new entrants that are growing very quickly, like TikTok, which is reaching a scale of hundreds of millions or billions of people around the world, and I think is growing faster than any of our services of the companies that are up here today, and certainly competitive with us. And that's just naming a few. Right? I mean, obviously there's Snapchat and a bunch of other services as well. So it's a very competitive marketplace.
Do you think, and I'll ask you this, Mr. Zuckerberg, I think you've commented that some of the privacy things that maybe the Europeans did would kind of solidify your dominance as a company. So what should we do in the United States on this? Because it's a different subject, but similar. To not do something that would stymie innovation, competition, and further, in my view, further create a monopolistic, or at least a perceived monopolistic environment.
Well, Congressman, I do think that the U.S. should have federal privacy legislation because I think we need a national standard, and I think having a standard that that is across the country that's as harmonized with standards in other places would actually create clearer expectations of industry and make it better for everyone. But I think the point that you're making is a really important one, which is if we ask companies to lock down data, then that to some degree can be at odds with asking them to open up data to enable whether it's academic research or competition. So I think that when we're writing this privacy regulation, we just should be aware of the interaction between our principles on privacy and our principles on competition. And that's why I think a more holistic view, like what Congressman Welch was just proposing, I think is perhaps a good way to go about this.
Okay, quickly, Mr. Dorsey, do you have any comments on that?
One of the reasons we're suggesting more of a protocol approach is to enable as many new entrants as possible. Okay. We want to be a client on that.
I want to thank
time has expired.
With that, I'll yield back.
Chair recognizes Ms. Clark for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you, the chairs and the ranking members for today's hearing. I also thank our witnesses for appearing. In January, I called for a public comment for the discussion draft of my bill, the Civil Rights Modernization Act of 2021, a narrowly focused proposal to protect historically marginalized communities from the harms of targeted advertising practices. These harms can and have infringed on the civil rights of protected classes, and I'm proud to formally introduce this bill next week to diminish inequities in the digital world. For time's sake, I ask our witnesses to please answer the questions as succinctly as possible. The first question goes to Mr. Zuckerberg. Facebook currently provides their advertisers with insight on how to get their ads in front of people who are most likely to find their ads relevant by utilizing tools to use criteria like consumers' personal interests, geography, to fine-tune the targeting. This is often used code that target or avoid specific races or other protected classes of people. Let me add that I'm aware of the updates to your special ad audience. However, why does Facebook continue to allow for discrimination in the placement of advertisements that can violate civil rights laws?
Congresswoman, we've taken a number of steps to eliminate ways that people can target different groups based on racial affinity and different ways that they might discriminate, because this is a very important area. And we have active conversations going on with civil rights experts as to the best ways to continue improving these systems, and we'll continue doing that.
Mr. Dorsey, Twitter allows advertisers to use demographic targeting to reach people based on location, language, device, age, and gender. In July, your company made changes to your ad targeting policy to advise advertisers to, quote, not wrongfully discriminate against legally protected categories of users, end quote. What did Twitter mean by the phrase wrongfully discriminate? Are some kinds of discriminatory advertising permitted on Twitter? If so, would you please explain?
No, not at all.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that answer.
No, none at all.
Okay, and so can you explain what you meant by wrongfully discriminate?
We mean that you shouldn't just use our ad systems to discriminate.
Oh, okay. Mr. Pichai, Google has recently announced a new approach in their targeting system called FLoC, or Federated Learning of Cohorts, to allow an ad targeting to groups of people with similar characteristics. The new system will utilize machine learning to create these cohorts for the consumer's visits to websites. Given the potentially biased and disparate impact of machine learning algorithms, how has Google addressed the potential discriminatory impact of this new FLoC system?
Congresswoman, it's an important area. We recently announced a joint collaboration with HUD to ban ads that would target age, gender, family status, zip code, in addition to race, which we've long disallowed. So we'll bring similar provisions, particularly when we are using machine learning. And by the way, FLoC is early. We haven't implemented it yet. We will be publishing more technical proposals on it. and they will be held to our AI principles, which prohibit discrimination based on sensitive categories, including race, and we will be happy to consult and explain our work there.
I appreciate that. Gentlemen, I just want you to be aware that the longer we delay in this, the more that these systems that you have created bake discrimination into these algorithms. I think that is critical that you get in there and that you do what is in the best interest of the public of the United States of America and undo a lot of the harm that has been created with the bias that has been baked into your systems. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back 23 seconds, and I thank you for this opportunity.
And I thank the gentlelady for that. The chair now recognizes Mr. Wahlberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the panel for being here. What I've listened to so far today, I'd have to say that based upon what many of us in Congress say about the best legislation, when both sides don't like it, it's probably good. And you've certainly hit that today. I think from both sides, you have been attacked for various reasons. But I have to say the platforms that you've developed are amazing, and they have huge potential. And they indeed have enabled us to go directions, information, communications, relationships that can be very positive and are amazing in what's been accomplished. I think we get down to how that is controlled and who controls it. Going back to our foundations as our country, it was our second president, John Adams, who said that our Constitution was meant for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate for any other. I think we're seeing a lot of the problems that you're frustrated with as a result of parents and families, churches, schools that aren't taking the primary responsibility. I get that. So it comes down to the choice that's left for the people is really between conscience and the constable. We're either going to have a conscience that self-controls, and as you said, Mr. Zuckerberg, in fact, what you said, I wouldn't mind my 3- and 5-year-old granddaughters coming to your house. I'm not asking for the invitation, but I think they'd be safe there relative to the online capabilities from what you said. But that's conscience versus constable. But what I've heard today is that there will be some constable, and I'm not sure that we'll have success in moving forward. So I guess, Mr. Chairman, unfortunately, we've been here before. We've been here many times. A few years ago, when Mr. Zuckerberg was here before this committee, I held up a Facebook post by a state senator in Michigan whose post was simply announcing his candidacy as a Republican for elected office, and yet it was censored as shocking and disrespectful or sensational in content. Just a few months ago, I posted my resolution that would add teachers to the vaccine priority list on Twitter, and it was labeled as, quote, sensitive content and encouraged to be changed. Well, hiding behind Section 230, all of you have denied that there's any bias or an inequitable handling of content on your platforms. And yet Pew Research Center found that, and this is where I have my problem, not so much with the platform or even the extent of what's on the platform, but they found that 72% of the public thinks it's likely that social media platforms actively censor political views that big tech companies find objectionable. Further, and I quote, by a 4-to-1 margin, respondents were more likely to say big tech supports the views of liberals over conservatives than vice versa, probably equaled only by higher education. That was my statement. And yet every time this happens, you fall back on blaming glitches in the algorithms. It was former Greg Coppola, former Google insider, who said before he was suspended by Google, he said, algorithms don't write themselves. We write them to do what we want them to do. That's my concern. Whether it's censoring pro-life groups like Live Action or pro-Second Amendment groups like the Well-Armed Women, their platforms continually shut down law-abiding citizens and constitutional discussions and commerce that don't align with big tech views
and the worldview. And this includes the First and Second Amendments that causes me to be concerned that you don't share the same freedom and constitutional concerns. It's not often I find myself agreeing with Bernie Sanders, but in an interview earlier this week, and I quote, he said, "If you're asking me, do I feel particularly comfortable that the President of the United States should not express his views on Twitter? I don't feel comfortable about that." He went on to say, because yesterday was Donald Trump who was blamed and tomorrow it could be somebody else. Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, do you think the law should allow you to be the arbiters of truth as they have under Section 230? Mr. Zuckerberg first.
Congressman, I think that it is good to have a law that allows platforms to moderate content. But as I've said today, I think that that we'd benefit from more transparency and accountability.
Mr. Dorsey?
I don't think we should be the arbiters of truth, and I don't think the government should be either.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I agree. Go back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and ranking members, for having this important hearing. I'd like to submit to the record a National Hispanic Media Coalition letter against Spanish language disinformation on social media. And if we could submit that for the record, I'd appreciate that. And also, my first question is to you, Mr. Zuckerberg. In 2020, Facebook brought in approximately $86 billion of revenue in 2020. Is that about right, give or take?
Congressman, I think that's about right.
Okay, thank you. Good. How much of that revenue did Facebook invest in identifying misinformation, disinformation in that portion of your business?
Congressman, I don't know the exact answer, but we invest billions of dollars in our integrity programs, including having more than 1,000 engineers working on this and 35,000 people doing content review across the company.
Okay, and how many people do you have full-time equivalents in your company overall?
Congressman, I don't know the exact number, but I think it's around 60,000.
Okay, so you're saying over half of the people in your company are doing the portion of content review, et cetera, which is the main subject we seem to be talking about today?
No, Congressman, because you asked about full-time employees, and some of the content reviewers are contractors.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, there seems to be a disparity between the different languages that are used on your platform in America. And as, for example, there was a study published in April by Avaz, and over 100 items of misinformation on Facebook in 6 different languages was found that 70% of the Spanish language content analyzed had not been labeled by Facebook, as compared to 30% of the English language misinformation that had not been labeled. So there seems to be a disparity there. What kind of investment is Facebook making on the different languages to make sure that we have more of an accuracy of flagging the disinformation and misinformation?
Congressman, thanks. We have an international fact-checking program where we work with fact checkers in more than 80 countries and in a bunch of different languages. In the U.S. specifically, we have Spanish-speaking fact checkers as well as English-speaking fact checkers. So that's on the misinformation side. But also, when we create resources with authoritative information, whether it's around COVID information or election information, we translate those hubs so that way they can be available in both English and Spanish. And we make it so that people can see the content in whatever language they prefer.
Thank you. So basically you're saying it's extensive.
Congressman, this is certainly something that we invest a lot in, and it will be something that we continue to invest more in.
Okay, I like the last portion. I do believe and would love to see you invest more. My 70-plus-year-old mother-in-law, who is primarily a Spanish speaker, commented to me the other day that her friends who communicate mainly in Spanish, and they do use the internet, they do use some of your platforms, gentlemen, that they were worried about the vaccine and that somebody's going to put a chip in their arm. For God's sakes, I mean, that to me just was unbelievable that they would comment on that. But they got most of that information on the internet, on various platforms. Clearly, Spanish language disinformation is an issue And I'd like to make sure that we see all of your platforms address these issues, not only in English, but in all languages. I think it's important for us to understand that a lot of hate is being spewed on the internet, and a lot of it is coming through many of your platforms. For example, there are 23 people dead in El Paso because somebody filled this person's head with a lot of hateful nonsense, and he drove to specifically kill Mexicans along the Texas-Mexican border. 8 people are dead in Atlanta because an anti-Asian hatred and misinformation has been permitted to spread and allowed on these platforms unchecked, pretty much unchecked. The spread of hatred and incitement of violence on platforms is a deadly problem in America, and we need to see that it stops. Mr. Zuckerberg, do you believe that you've done enough to combat these kinds of issues?
Congressman, I believe that our systems and that we've done more than basically any other company, but I think that there's still a problem and there's still more that needs to be done.
Okay, it's good. You'd like to do more. Thank you. I only have 15 seconds, so I'm going to ask this question to all 3 of you. Do you think that each one of your organizations should have an executive level individual in charge of this department reporting directly to the CEO? Do you agree that should be the case? Mr. Zuckerberg.
Congressman, we have an executive level person who's in charge of the integrity team that I talked about, and he's on my management team.
Reports directly to you.
Congressman, he does not. I only have a few direct reports.
Okay.
A lot of people on the management team report to them.
Thank you. To the other 2 witnesses, very quickly.
Congressman, we have senior executives, including someone who reports directly to me, who oversees trust and safety across all these areas.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey.
We do.
Thank you so much.
Gentlemen's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Carter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. Mr. Zuckerberg, I'd like to start with you, and I wanted to ask you, you're aware, as all of us are, of the disaster that we have at the southern border. To indicate that human smugglers have been using social media, including Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, to coordinate their operations in transporting illegal immigrants into the United States. Things like what to say to authorities, transportation tips, and other forms of information that are being traded on your platform to evade authorities and contribute to the crisis, this disaster at the border. Mr. Zuckerberg, do you feel complicit in any way that your platform is assisting in this disaster?
Congressman, first, let me say that what's happening at the border is
I'm not. You know what's happening at the border. I'm asking you specifically about your platform. Do you feel complicit in what your platform is doing to assist in this disaster?
Congressman, we have policies and we're working to fight this content. We have policies against scams and pages, groups, and events like the content that you're talking about. We're also seeing the State Department use our platform to share factual information with people about what is going on. I think that's
I'm talking about coyotes who are using your platform to spread this kind of information to assist in this illegal activity that is resulting in horrible conditions for these people who are trying to come across that border.
Congressman, that's against our policies, and we're taking a lot of steps to stop it. And again, I mean, let me just say that I think that the situation at the border is really serious, and we're taking it very seriously.
Well, and I hope you'll look into these reports that your platform is being used by these traffickers. This is something we need your help with. I hope you feel a sense of responsibility, sir, to help us with this, because we certainly need it. Let me ask you something. You dedicated a lot of your written testimony to election issues, and even today during this hearing, you've been very public in pushing back about the election claims in November. Yet, when Facebook has been essentially silent on the attempted theft of the certified election in Iowa of Representative Miller Meeks, why is that? Why are you silent on that, yet you're not silent on other elections?
Congressman, I think what we saw leading up to January 6th was unprecedented in American history, where you had a sitting president trying to undermine the peaceful transfer of power.
You determine which one is important and which one is not. This seat to these people who elected this duly certified representative, this is the most important thing to them as well.
Congressman, I think part of what made the January 6th events extraordinary was not just that the election was contested, but that you had folks like the
Okay, then
president.
let me ask you this. What is it that makes this particular issue irrelevant that you're not even covering?
Congressman, I didn't say that it's irrelevant, but on January 6th, we had insurrectionists storm the Capitol, leading to the death of multiple people.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I'm aware of that. I was there. I understand what happened. But again, will you commit to treating this as a serious election concern? What's going on in Hyde?
Congressman, I will commit to that, and we apply our policies to all situations. And I think that this is different from what happened on January 6th, but we apply our policies equally in these cases.
Mr. Dorsey, you too have been very silent on this issue on your platform. Will you commit to treating this as a serious concern, the attempted theft of the certified seat in Iowa?
Yes, we're looking for all opportunities to minimize anything that takes away from the integrity of elections.
Okay, Mr. Dorsey, while I've got you, let me ask you, you've started a new program. It's called the Bird Watch, and it allows people to identify information in tweets that they believe is misleading and to write notes to provide context in an effort to stop misleading information from spreading. Have you seen, we've seen mobs of Twitter users cancel others even when the information they share is accurate. Why do you think Bird Watch is going to work, given the culture that you created on your platform?
Well, it's an experiment. We wanted to experiment with more a crowdsource approach than us going around and doing all this work.
Don't you think that's kind of a dangerous experiment when you're taking off truthful information?
No, it's an alternative. And I think we need to experiment as much as possible to get to the right answers. I think it's
okay. Well, that's fine as long as you're not the one being experimented on. As long as you're not the one that the information.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair announces that we're going to take a recess now for 15 minutes. So the committee will stand in recess until 3:18, and then we'll come back promptly. I call the committee in recess.